the various fields of mechanics, solid mechanics. And recently she got a Marie Curie fellowship to study the knee biomechanics, in particular the implants that you could replace menisci once they are damaged with. So the idea would be to create a replacement for menisci once they are damaged. For example, if you do ultra running or if you do some high intensity loading on your knees, such as what I do every day when I run. After a while, you probably destroy your knees. Maybe not. Maybe you make them healthier. This is not so well known. But anyhow, there are many people that you probably know that destroyed their knees completely, and they had to have replacement of the menisci, and these things are not working very well at the moment. So this is what Olga will talk about, and the second talk, which I will introduce later, will go in similar directions, although from a different perspective. So Olga, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I look forward to your talk.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. So yeah, it'll be a bit of a different talk, I think, from yesterday, but let's see. The focus is data-driven at the end of the day. So this is really the team I'm working with. It's basically half clinician and half engineers. I am bridging between 3 different research groups at the moment. So I joined the NAFIL department. Oh, what happened? Oh, okay. Kind of about 2 years ago. And really, David Murray is the orthopedic surgeon that is leading that group. It's just a fantastic person, not only for his 530 papers and an H index of 80, but mainly for his tube sailing boats. He's going sailing around the world, so really looking up to him. Then there is another group, the Engineering Science Department, which I spent about 9 years of my life, so it's very difficult to just cut the umbilical cord, but I'm doing lots of experiments there at the moment. And then I am also at the Oxford Brookes University, where I've been a senior lecturer for 2 weeks before Mummy EU rescued me, giving me this Marie Curie fellowship. So I had to say, I'm sorry, I have to leave. But they managed to keep me in, so I didn't lose my job, so everything was fine. So anyway, that's really the group. What is the knee? I mean, I'm sure that probably Bernd and Caroline will be much better than me on the anatomy of things, but essentially there are 2 main bones involved in the knee joints, the femur and the tibia. They are not flat. This pointer doesn't work, but anyway. So there are some eminences here, which are the femur condyles, and then there is the tibia underneath. In between them, there is there are lots of things inside, especially the 2 menisci, the lateral and the medial. That is, you can see although structurally they might be, they are very similar, but kinematically they behave completely different way. With the lateral meniscus that moves much more during the loading, the medial meniscus is more constrained, and probably that's why we see most of the tears and the problem in the medial meniscus. But there we go. So what does the meniscus does? Well, lots of kind of function, basically provide load transmission between femur and tibia. If you think that this little thing can support us walking and running, and it doesn't wear, of course if it's healthy, absorb impact, and it's just a tiny little thing. When I first see it, I said, well, I'm going to cut with a scalpel straight away, and it just resists to, you try to cut, and it just kind of doesn't want you to cut him, so it's quite interesting. From an engineering point of view, it's really an exceptional material because it's a functionally graded material. If you look, kind of going from the central body to the posterior anterior horn, it just changed completely its properties. It goes from a quite tough fiber-reinforced cartilage to like ligaments, and then it blends into bones, and it just is such a smooth transition that even take them out of cadaver, it's really difficult. So wow, nature, I guess. So what happened when you get a tear or the meniscus is badly torn? especially a few years ago, they used to remove it or partially removed it, and when you do it, you can see that the contact pressure profile changed completely, and that is gonna impact your cartilage. So then you get cartilage degeneration, osteoarthritis, and you need a knee replacement. So, and that's why, because the meniscal replacement don't really work. The NHS in the UK, but also in Italy, don't just bother. They are not cost effective. They need to be replaced every year or two. And if you see compression tests on real meniscus and on these type of things, I was amazed after 1,000 of cycle of fatigue loading, the real meniscus was just bouncing back, and these things were just getting thinner and thinner, just completely useless anyway. So I do understand why the NHS doesn't spend money on that. So one of the alternatives is that when you get cartilage degeneration, like in this case, what the clinician do, or the surgeon do, they just remove a bit of bones, put metals in, plastic in between, which is really a piece of plastic, which is called the knee bearing. It's quite ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. And there we go. The bad news is that you can have this when you are about 75 to 70. So if you are 40 and you damage your meniscus and you want to be active, then there is no way. In the UK, they say one word, tough, such is life. We are British, we can suffer. You poor European hypochondriac. But anyway, so that's kind of, we want to avoid to get to that stage. This is my goal. I want to really focus on how not to get to that stage. So the other things that they do, that we do in Oxford, is basically trying to find area where technology, especially surgical technology, can be improved. And what they look at, and that's what David Murray has really clear focus. He really believes in simulation and computational work in order to avoid two things. One of his main worries is fracture of the bones when you do the implants, because he always tells me you have to get right the first time, because if you start damaging the bones, then you get infection, then it's not good. And also the bearing dislocation. So if the bearing then moves around your body, is also not good news. And another thing that I'm really 100% on is wear. So these bearings are, they changed two things in the last 7 years. One was the design, and one was a little bit the material. And then they start having a wear rate that was like 4 times more than before. So they came to me and say, Olga, can you model wear? And I was like, okay, let me check. So what happened is that with improved surgical procedure, and David is quite proud that his patient can, cycle and run with a knee bearing. That's called, by the way, the Oxford knee, of course, because it's Oxford. So they can really kind of move the knee as it was a native one. This bearing moves. It's like free to move in all directions. And what he does when you flat, he goes to the back and he just right here. So there is a overhang at the back, and is where you have wear, so it gets thin and it fracture, and it's always at that point. So we are trying to find out a better design to change the design in order to avoid that. In order to do that, we built at Brooks actually a rig, a knee simulator where we put 2 bearing in parallel, and we implemented any gating cycle that we want to simulate like really the normal activities and study how they wear. So that's good news. And then of course after that we use Abacus as a main program. I'm going to kind of build a routine that move the mesh according to a wear rate that we are going to see experimentally first. So anyway, let's try not to kind of get to the knee replacement. So you're going to be too old to have it. So let's see what we can do in terms of meniscus, and that's really the key point of my fellowship. I really wanted to understand the relationship between structure and function in order to then be able to design a new family of meniscal replacement. So there are, when I was writing the proposal, I said, okay, there are three things that are important. One is understanding the architecture, and of course a different length scale. The other thing is going to be mechanical properties, because if you look at the literature, first of all, on human menisci, there is not very much, and all the data are just, out of 10 times between each other. And the other thing is that we needed to have a tool in order to simulate how the meniscus behave under loading. And then you can do only by doing modeling. So the idea is to, do some a lot of microscopy work and advanced microscopy work, doing some mechanical testing. Then once you have all your data, and that's why I think my fellowship, it's good that he's here, because we really need to do some data-driven modeling. Especially we are interested to kind of figure out what is the simplest material model that can be used at a continuum level for the meniscus, and also what are the important mechanical parameters to look at. So we'll see. And why is so important to have an accurate model of the knee? I mean, I've seen lots of models of the knee, but a lot of them do ignore the meniscus, or they just treat as a linear elastic body with, so they don't really pay attention to it. And what is important really from a modeling perspective is to measure contact pressures and contact area, because that's what changes when you have a tear, and the contact pressures profile completely change. So, and it's not really easy to measure experimentally as well. So the only way we have is modeling. And then I started to lead a kind of review and comparison work about what is available in the literature and why it's important that we make a contribution. Well, this is some experimental test, and I've asked one of the postdocs to fit that with different material models that are used in the literature. Those are the most common. First of all, my first impression was, oh, so none of them really work. If you can see, that is completely off the experimental curve. And then I said, okay, let's get this model, let's run it with different material models. And then what you see is that, how do I do the video here? So that's what we get. This is a plot just for assuming that the meniscus is linear elastic. You can see that the lateral meniscus, yes, moves a bit more. But then I said, well, what about the contact pressure? How do they change? And this is the plot. So if you use these different, sorry it's a bit small, but they still don't get that they have to write big fonts. But anyway, so there's a huge difference if you use different models in terms of contact pressure. So really we need to get there. It's not good. So, okay, so let's look at the architecture first. So this is a micro CT scan of the meniscus, of one portion of the meniscus. And what really struck me is those are collagen fascicles, and they are arranged in such a way that basically they are like channels through which the fluid can flow. So there was a bit something different from what I was expecting reading the literature, but anyway, this is an image of the kind of the cross section of this. So I've extracted cylinder in different direction because, of course, the behavior is anisotropic. So if you look at different direction, you see different behavior, and then this is what we get. So highly porous microstructure. So that's the gray, it's collagen fibers, and the black is just voids. Some of them, some of these pores close, some of them stay open. It's like a luck. And we were really lucky enough to see that actually it's the same structure. The nanoscale, we have exactly the same structure. So just nature is, I guess, fantastic. I waited 1 year to have this because I thought that was going to be the case, but with the scanning electron microscopy, we made it. So water flows through these channels, it's the key. We did also multiphoton microscopy because it's really interesting. This is a fully wet tissues. It's really interesting to see kind of the, this is an image of the cross section, that essentially, first of all, it's like empty. There is this in green, we have collagen, and those red things are elastin fibers. What we could see, this is in the vascularized region of the meniscus, which is only the outer part. Only a third of the meniscus is vascularized. What we can see is that collagen and elastin follow each other. They have the same orientation, and I think one key thing to see is to grow kind of elastin and collagen together under loading and see what they do. But anyway, that's probably another project. So regarding then the mechanical properties, what I am doing is experimental testing at different scale, of course, making things even more difficult, because the properties are essentially dependent on the location and the orientation as well. So everything is not, it's a bit complicated. And plus, I have delighted myself doing a biaxial testing. And first of all, I prepared the sample. And what I saw is that each sample is different. If you look at the microstructure, I mean, I'm used to look at that, but one portion of this is only 7 mil, one portion has no fiber, another portion has fiber, and the fiber are oriented in kind of in a curved way. And then when you test it, and you want to do kind of digital image correlation to see the strain map is a mess. It's not uniform. I didn't even know where to get stress-strain curve, because I said, where? And other colleague in biomechanics said, oh, it's easy, just do an average, and then fit it with the Ogden model. I was like, surely not. I said, no, that's not going to be. And I said, but biomechanics is not an exact science. And my first answer was, well, it needs to be more exact than medicine, one. And two, if we don't really push the boundary, then biomechanics will just stay a waste of public money, like we like to say. So anyway, so that's just to say that there is a lot of work to do. And so now we are really at the point here where we say how we proceed, because we have lots of materials, people that can do testing, but then in the end, it's like, okay, how can we interpret those tests? So one idea that actually Stefan had, and I think is a good one, is that we could test the meniscus in different regions and for different patients, and then map those into a reference meniscus, a bit like what we do in fan element with the current and parent element, which I think could improve things, because then when you get a new patient in and you do more tests, you enrich the knowledge of kind of the current knowledge. But the other thing is really what are the most important features, so architecture-wise or material parameters, that really we need to take into account if we want to replace the native tissue. So, so my understanding of the structure function is that the meniscus is a cushion, it's impermeable, really low permeability outside. It's full of channels, so you walk and the water or the synovial fluid moves around. Is it fully saturated or not? I don't know, but maybe with simulation we can explore different scenarios. But really, it's important to understand the fluid flow inside hopefully a healthy meniscus. So how we have two options, either we do experimentally or we do numerically, and I've done experimentally, we are exploring the numerical side of things. So experimentally what we did, it's pore mechanics testing, so it's confined compression test. So we get a meniscus, we extract cylinder in different direction and in different portion, like the central body, posterior anterior horn. We put inside a chamber where the meniscus is supposed to be perfectly confined. The reality is that very difficult to get perfect cylinders and perfect confinement. Then you compress it, and the fluid can only flow from the base because it's a porous base. So then you can study the fluid flow, hopefully. And what we did is that we measure the weight of the cylinders versus time. So the more the water expelled, the less is weight. And then we correlate that with the fluid flow, and then we saw that actually the classical Darcy law is not appropriate. So the Darcy law really links fluid flow with gradient of pressure. It's just a linear phenomenological relationship. Instead, what we saw, that if we put in front of the gradient of pressures a time derivative of non-integer order, then this is where we get good solution. The problem is that with that, then you end up with a kind of a permeability tensor that has a weird unit, and beta, which is the order of the fractional derivative, that it's not integer, so it can be any number between 0 and 1, which we are not really sure how they are related compared to the microstructure. But anyway, if you see, then we have a model, so we fit all this data, and the fittings are pretty good. Once we have that, I actually have built a 3D fractional elastic model I've implemented into Abacus, so I can actually run the tests in terms of pore pressure. What happened is in this cylinder is a little bit what happened in soil mechanics or sand. It's essentially compaction, so at the beginning, the pore pressure gets all the loads, and then once the fluid is expelled, then the solids start to deform. So what happened when kind of the value of beta increase is that we have the diffusion, the pore pressure diffusion get much faster, so the solids start deforming much earlier. So it's really a transient, the transient time that changes. So that's also interesting, but we'll see. So the other thing that we ask is that, okay, we saw that we think is, we have used this fractional model. It's not a classical Darcy, but then we ask, well, can we trust experiments? I didn't do, not many of them. I have maybe 22 experiments that were successful. But then if you look at different portions of the meniscus, especially the posterior anterior horn, it's very difficult to get good samples. And I was in the Rizzoli hospital, so in Italy it's just the best center you can go to for orthopedic research. So I wasn't like in the third world lab, but still very difficult. So then, even that I'm here with these really clever modelers. So why can we just run this experiment in silico using images that come from high definition medical images, like this micro CT scan that I showed you, but I'm improving also the resolution because things are not easy. So then we can do these confined compression tests in the computer and see how the fluid flow inside, which is something that is very difficult to measure experimentally anyway. So, and then we could use these results in order to kind of learn from them what are the parameters in terms of permeability tensor and relationship between fluid flow and gradient of pressure. Is it Darcian or not? That's one of the main key. The challenge is that if reality kicks in, and if you see these medical imaging and how the porosity change, in these cases it was impossible to create a mesh. This other case was impossible to create mesh. This one as well, it was just too complicated, too many changes. It's not easy. The only sample we could take in was this, because if you see the porosity is basically almost constant, and I think we have to chop it there where it's the same porosity, and then we can move on. So it's not easy to go for medical image, and that's what Anna and Vasilis kind of had fun with creating this mesh. So this is a portion of actually this scan. And so it's, as you see, the numbers here, 60 million faces. It's just, try to simplify it, and Anas is really spending a bit of his time on that. And so once the kind of the mesh is simplified, then we can, so in red we have the solid part, blue it's all voids, and then in green is the transition region. So then if we have a mesh like that, we can fill with fluid, apply a compressive force, and then measuring the fluid flow and obtaining the permeability tensor. So then I said, okay, while we do all this work, I don't think we can mimic exactly the native behavior of a very clever tissue. But what we can do, we can be inspired by it and simplify in a way the microstructure, numerical, generating digital microstructure, but that actually could give us the same characteristic that we saw with the native one. So this is like a dream. I don't know if we'll never make it, but this is the key, I think, then to guide really the design of new implants. And what I show, it was, it's really a focus on the meniscus, but I think the same kind of framework can be applied to any kind of tissue. So concluding, meniscus have lots of nice and clever properties, quite complex microstructure. We saw that the Darcilo, that is really the fractional Darcy that at the moment tell us how the fluid flow behave. Yeah, one of the weak points is yes, but what is the link between the order of the derivative, for instance, and the parameter you get from that? It's still an open question, but then I've asked myself, does it really matter? I don't know. So we are trying to run this kind of test on real microstructure, and hopefully use machine learning approach to find what is the simplest model we can use. And the overall objective, it's here, and we really need all the effort from different people and different backgrounds, actually, microscopy, mechanics, numerics, everything. And that's it, that's my talk. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Olga.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Actually, I was wondering that if you have thought about the effect of macro-scale deformation on micro-scale properties, maybe that curvature is could be because of the interaction between macro and micro scale.
You mean the fittings? You mean all the models?
Maybe that the fluid, the profile of fluid flow.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, each, this is just an example, is for the anterior part, but each cylinder that you extract is going to be different from the next one. So you really need like 1,000 of tests on them, because how can you tell? I mean, that could be the effect, because there I have a porosity that is higher than another one, so the fluid flow much quicker, or kind of an order of the derivative that is higher. With 20 experimental tests, I mean, it's not very easy to say what are the properties.
Yeah, I mean, imagine that this is quite homogeneous and idealized.
Very idealized.
Then,
yes.
if we apply, if we have a deformation on macro scale, maybe in micro scale also, we could have some changes due to that deformation.
Of course,
and that's exactly what I'm wondering, that because they are fully coupled. Like
it is fully coupled, and I think what happens when you do a macroscopic deformation, first thing is your pore will change the shape. Some of them they're open or close, who knows? So it's really, I think, it's the ratio between closed porosity and open porosity that drives the process. But it could be many things, and I'm still at the beginning, I think. So I don't know. Yes.
I had exactly the same question.
Yes.
Because probably, what is the entity of your deformation? When you apply your law,
yes.
What is the entity? 5–10%?
No, more than that. We can get to 25%.
It's very probable that if you introduce a dependence on the permeability tensor,
of course,
on the deformation of the solid scaffold, it's sure that you will recover the.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I mean that's for sure, and also the rate in which you load also will change things. Yes.
May I ask, first of all, congratulations, your talk was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
I realized that different parts of the meniscus have different structure.
Yes.
But have you studied whether every meniscus shares the same distribution of structures? I mean, if you make a map of the meniscus, would the same regions have the same, let's say, general structure in every specimen that you test?
Well, I spent about 1 year doing advanced microscopy, so it's not maybe very long, but I look at probably, I have to say, 10 menisci. Some of them were healthy, which I was really lucky because they came from a knee replacement surgery of a patient that had only one meniscus pretty damaged and the other was healthy. And I could say, and I've done a lot of sections, really quite a lot. And I think the general trend is the same. You see, I mean, it's porous structure and these microchannels at different levels. The nanoscale, microscale are there. What the change is, probably a little bit the porosity or the ratio between the two. But I think architecturally it's about the same. But then I've been told to really look at the meniscal roots. So when really it gets them to the ligament and the bone, because it's that where then apparently lots of tears happen, and if that happens, it changes the boundary condition of the problem, and you can get really strange movements, and you can have kind of the two cartilage touching, and then degeneration and stuff like that. But I think overall, for architecture, I'm pretty sure. For mechanical properties, I don't know. I'm still. We have 3 students that now they've been locked in the lab for about 6 months, so we'll see. Yes.
Just a suggestion.
Yes.
I think when you're building the porous materials,
yes.
in order to capture the deformation, you need to do a really systematic calculation for the mechanics independent from the fluid flow. So I really recommend that you need to understand possibly the core collapse. Maybe just do simple hydrostatic test,
yes.
and then do confinement. Just a compression confinement test,
yes.
and also 2 triaxial tests. I know that for one sample, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but then you can fully characterize that what's the impact of when people are asking about the mechanics. You can kind of decouple them, but I mean it's a porous media, but you need to see possibly what's the role of the porosity, and then these curves would be a function of the mean stress, and then you have that pore pressure dependence.
Yeah, and I wanted really to do this triaxial test, and then I had to resign myself that it just was impossible to do in less than 2 years of time.
Oh,
I mean, I could do 1D tests. I just because I had to build a rig, and because how do you do triaxial experimentally? I mean, you have to build something from scratch. Right?
Well, I know that at least in the US there are some universities that they have the capabilities to do it.
That's
but
good.
yeah, so maybe
You can give me some names.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to do myself, and then I said that's probably a problem for like 10 years.
Oh.
Yes.
You can also try to do this numerically when you have shown the microscale model.
This is what
And
we want to
you
do.
compress, you solve Stokes problem, you compress a little bit more, and this way you can have an estimation of the impact of strain.
And this is what we want to do really, numerically fast and experimentally well. But no, it's interesting because we want to do things that are impossible to do experimentally. Yes.
I can only imagine that every part of the meniscus is actually different. Have you considered maybe orthopedic surgeons usually they divide the meniscus in 9?
3 and 9?
Yeah, because there is the anterior, central, and posterior part, and then there are 3.
The vast, yes.
And actually, the more central part of the meniscus is thinner, and it has lower vascularity.
Yes.
Than actually the external parts.
So now we will, with this student that we have, because I did some preliminary stuff, but now we do like systematically, and we are going to look at the vascular, so the red zone, the white zone, the intermediate zone, and different, the 3 different portions. So that in that way we are going to have data, we are going to generate a lot of data, which we need to do something clever with, otherwise it's just waste of time. But yes, this is what we expect to happen. I've done for microscopy, but not for mechanical tests.
Maybe one thing before we move to Bernd, because otherwise we'll be there tomorrow. Motivating talk. Maybe what Susanna, if you don't think anymore, but what showed yesterday with the cut-fem approach could go above these meshing difficulties.
Yes.
Because at least if the method works as promisingly as it is written on the can, then theoretically it should solve these issues. Maybe it doesn't work as written on the can, in which case then we need to improve the method.
Yes.
But it seems to me like a logical thing to do, but the background mesh would not be fixed because you have very small channels and very large channels, so you need to refine adaptively the background mesh, even though it's still an implicit description of the interface.
Yes.
Okay, maybe it's for later. Thank you so much once again. All right. So now the next talk is by Bernd Grimm, who is from LIROMS. Right? Yes.
Maybe I connect after save time. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So, in fact, we got acquainted through. I didn't know Huawei had laptops. Very nice. Hopefully not better than mine. Yes, so other topic. So we got acquainted through Olga, actually, because Olga is connected with the Oxford Knee Group, who is connected to one of the surgeons at the Institute at CHL and Aish Clinic, and that's the way we got connected. So Bernd originally is a mechanical engineer, so more or less like a lot of us are, or between at least engineering. And now he's working in biomechanics for a very long time, on the knee in particular, and here this is about more how to embed wearable sensors and try to use them to understand activity and monitoring of activity, which in Luxembourg, as you could see from the talk by Thomas Kelstenius yesterday from the list, is going to be one of the leading things that the country wants to do, because they want to twin Luxembourg and create a digital twin of it. So I guess this will be one of the key things to be done. Well, thank you so much. We really look forward to your talk.
Great.
Sorry for the delay, but just
I think it's nice to have this open discussions and flexibility. And thank you, Steph, and the organizers, for inviting me to speak at this very nicely composed conference where there is so much input to the digital twin theme. Very inspiring, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to talk about the contribution of wearable devices for activity monitoring to create a digital twin. A digital twin and it fits nicely to the previous talk, for instance, to generate a profile on how people move and how much people move to drive such simulations in a clinically relevant way. And we've seen the simulator and how to design the simulator, or how to feed your in silico simulation of wear or deformation relies very much on how people move and also on how much people move, especially if we want to study wear and fatigue. So this is a very important subject. And it comes from the field of functional patient assessment, and from that generating a twin or a digital twin. And this is a list of where in the clinical practice functional assessment is performed. One way is to ask the patients by paper. That's the classic way. That's often only what the patient thinks they can do. Then you can take a performance test. It's quite common in the clinic where a doctor asks a patient to perform a certain task, and based on this task they evaluate the performance. There are things like the 6-minute walk test, get up and go test. It just gives a very simple numeric figure. You can take then people into the lab, into the gait lab with video motion capture. It's a very specialist environment, very precise, where you can study how people move, but then they are being observed, and you cannot study many subjects. It's a very unnatural environment. And then you can go, and that's the new trend in clinical outcome assessment, to go into the real world. So to go where the patients are and where they are not observed. And there are two disciplines. One is that you let a patient perform a performance test in a natural environment and then take the measurement, or you put on a wearable device that the patient wears over a long period of time, and then you monitor the activity, and when you identify and classify an activity, you dive into the quality of this activity. And the red labels down there are where wearable sensors can contribute. But today I want to speak mainly about free field monitoring, so to monitor physical activity. And that's very important to do free field activity monitoring, because it happens in the natural environment, in the real world. It's unobserved. It's continuous, so it's not only a snapshot. Especially in patients, there may be days when they are good or bad. It does not require a visit, so it can be done remotely. It's hoped to be low cost, but that has to be seen. And what we study is through this, we study behavior, so what the patient does do, not what he can do. But we can also look at what he can do. Once we know the activity, we can dive into the quality of it. And I think it's also a patient report. It's just a patient report, not in words, but in body language. So how a person moves is like an expression of outcome. And then there's also the term of a digital biomarker. In the movements, you can identify a specific aspect or a distribution of this aspect over the day to express elements of fatigue, which can serve as a biomarker. And I think that would then lead to the concept of a digital twin based on activity data. And to study physical activity is very important. We know it's increasingly recognized how relevant this is in health. It's considered the medicine of the 21st century. And there's a lot of evidence that increasing physical activity reduces disease risks by an enormous amount. So I firmly believe that when you establish an activity profile of a patient momentarily or over life, that's as expressive of an individual's condition, health condition or profile, like the genome or the microbiome or the exposome. That's why I call it actome. And for me, the actome can be a digital twin component. So if it's so important, why has it not been measured already? And it has. So this is going on, these activity monitoring for like 20 years. But it has, on a clinical research grade, mainly focused on energy expenditure for lifestyle interventions for losing weight, and not for driving models of musculoskeletal conditions, for instance. Or there are these consumer-grade devices that are available in the shops, but they are first only measuring very simple parameters, and they are not accurate. We cannot use them. So when we go into clinical-grade monitoring, and into orthopedics or another disease area where we have to be more specific, we have to study, for instance, we study physical activity because it's often a reason for intervention. So people will seek treatment because they have pain, but also because they cannot perform certain movements anymore. So when there's a torn meniscus, they cannot participate in sports, for instance. And after the treatment, we need to evaluate, or would like to know what kind of state of movement and activity maybe you're safe to return to work or to play, for instance, in athletes. And physical activity is a healing stimulus of bone and also of soft tissues. For instance, of osseointegration of implants, or if there's an artificial meniscus eventually put in, it would be very interesting to know what kind of post-operative exercise regime is safe and helps the integration of the tissues. So it's a protective and a risk factor at the same time. So we need it, but we can also overdo it. So we need to study it. And of course, it's related to wear and to survival of especially of all these artificial structures. So we need to do it, and this applies also to other diseases. And therefore, you need to go more in detail. So not just calorie consumption and sleep, what these fitness trackers and so far the monitors have been measuring, but you have to look what activities are being performed. Can a patient climb stairs? Can he squat? Can he run? Then also, how long are these activities taking place? Or is there the need to interrupt your walking by a break because you need to recover, or you have a sensation of pain? You need to count the events of these activities. How often does something happen? And once you classify them, you have to go into the details. So if there's a sit-stand transfer of a patient with a knee injury or after treatment, how often does it happen, but also how fast does it happen, and is there a compensation mechanism involved that indicates that there's still something not ideal? And when you look at these kind of questions, they fit nicely with the WHO components of what they consider physical activity. We need to know the type, the time, the frequency and intensity, and that has not yet been studied. It's a discipline that's just emerging right now. And how can you do that? By using wearable sensors, and there are many ways available, and I'm not promoting a particular solution. I just give an example. There are pressure insoles, there are textile electromyography systems which measure the electrical signals of the bones. You can have also cardiograms or dermal resistance for sweating, for instance, if you are interested in it, or flex sensors that can measure joint angles. But the majority comes from using inertial measurement sensors, primarily accelerometers, and increasingly due to battery life, also gyroscopes that include magnetometers, barometers, may also include GPS, and then you can intelligently fuse these signals using so-called Kalman filtering. And when you do that and you combine it with a human kinematic model, so there we come again into the modeling world, then you can have an attitude and heading reference system which can give you the position in space using such a device. And when you put all of them together, you can actually create a suit which can give you a perfect representation of a subject in the real world performing activities. And in sports applications that's used, but then this kind of suit is again so expensive, and and you would not walk around in this for days. So this is again only a specialist solution, so not suitable for monitoring. When you do monitoring, you usually only go for a single sensor solution. That means you get reduced data, but you may only be interested in specific aspects. So when you do that, you choose the dimension of physical activity that you're interested in for your particular investigation. And that gives you then the information that you would like to achieve. And I've been working with a lot of different sensors. The ones that are encircled in red are the ones that I'm working with. Most of them they use accelerometers and other inertial measurement units. And again, I'm not promoting any of this. I actually think that we as scientists, we should be device independent and more think about the algorithms and the validity of what's behind it. And that's what I like to promote. And I want to tell you how to get from a sensor signal like that to the digital twin, or to a clinical trial, or to a digital trial. So you have the sensor. You need to select the device. You need to validate the hardware if it actually measures what's claimed to do, or is there drift in the signal. You have to choose a wear location, and that of course depends on what you want to measure. If you want to measure lower extremity activity, of course it makes sense to put it close closer to the lower extremity, and vice versa if you want to measure shoulder physical activity or spinal activity, you need to put it on the upper body. Then you have to choose the parameters that you want to evaluate, and that often happens in collaboration with the clinicians who are interested in a specific activity, or with the people who are developing a musculoskeletal model on a computer and like to have a specific input for their model. For instance, how many steps on a stair are being performed by the average patient in order to test if the implant wears out over the given time period. It can also be developed patient-centric, so you may involve a patient clinic where you inquire what are actually the activities that they like to achieve and feel limited in. Then you need to develop an algorithm that, based on the sensor signal, actually derives these parameters. And then you have to validate if that actually happens in the real world, because you may have a concept on how to derive from sensor signal an activity classification, but you have to validate if that really happens in real life. So you need to have a ground truth, which is quite a challenge in this discipline. So how do you generate ground truth in the real world, knowing, okay, now the patient is stair climbing, now the patient is sitting, sleeping, cycling, walking, running, and then that you can have a validation against the ground truth to prove your algorithm. And then you need to have a clinical validation, because maybe when you know you can measure a certain parameter, you still have to prove that this is a clinically relevant parameter, so that actually the treatment changes this parameter, or this parameter is correlated with a disease state and not just out of academic interest. And then you may have your digital twin or clinical trial, where you then may still have to add regulatory approval to it, generate a product and a service about. And below there are two disciplines which come very important in this context. Is the usability, because you can have the greatest solution, but if the patient does not wear the device, then we will not generate the data. And the data security privacy aspect becomes an issue. As I said before, the activity profile is so characteristic of a subject that, like a gene profile, if you don't protect this, you may exhibit information that is very personal. I mean, if there's as an example, if you always see a certain movement distance that actually happens to be maybe between the house where you live and some kind of illegal activity nearby, you may generate a profile where you could find this out. So how to classify or how to generate from the signal such algorithms? Give you quickly a run through how this may go. So you have the signal, you filter and pre-process it by filtering. Then you have to decide a window, because you will have maybe weeks, month, or a year of data at high frequency, 100 Hertz or so. So you have to decide on how you cut up the signal. You can have a sliding window of a fixed or adjustable length, or what becomes increasingly popular, you can base it on an event, so that you window by event. Then you have to generate features from the signal. It can be done heuristically based on biomechanical principles, or they can be generated by complex analysis. So you can run a Fourier transform on entropy analysis over the signal. And then you need to classify your activity. That can also be done either by very simple methods, straightforward methods. So if you want to find out if someone is sleeping or active, you can define a threshold and just validate if that threshold is appropriate. You can then have hierarchical methods and decision trees, how to classify. So, okay, when someone is inactive, active, and is inactive, it may be sleep. When someone is or sitting or lying, so then you have to have another tree, and you have an active, and you can say, okay, this is walking or running or cycling, and you can generate such a tree. And then, of course, increasingly popular are machine learning methods, how to classify. And there's a wonderful paper, it's now 10 years old already, where all these methods are beautifully described. So that what's now so trendy is already in the scene for quite a long time. The approach that I've been primarily using and have been developing uses a single sensor attached to the lateral leg. It runs at 100 Hertz. All the analysis is done in post-processing, which also means that we can run much more sophisticated algorithms than if the algorithms are implemented on the device. And we usually measure for a week. It can easily be measured much longer. And I give you an example on how this may look like. This is a typical signal from such a leg-worn accelerometer, and you can see photos of different postures and activities, and you can already with the human eye, you can already identify characteristics of the signal, so you can imagine that applying filters and rules, you can define algorithmic principles to detect this. And when you do that, you can get a lot of postures and activities that can be classified like sitting, lying, standing, transfers, walking, and the individual steps, based on which you then can measure the cadence or the steps per minute. You can see if someone is running or walking, if someone is stair climbing, if someone is walking the stairs up or down, if someone is turning, and so forth. So these are activities that can be classified and then in their quality be analyzed. So this is also a slide to show that there are two aspects that we look at. It's the behavioral component, which is more like how many events are being conducted, how long does it take, how are they distributed, and when we dive into the detail and we look at if someone walks, how fast someone walks, if someone does a turn, how fast is the turn, or how symmetric is the walk or the run. That's then the qualitative component or the micro level activity. And I give you some clinical applications that you know what I'm talking about. For instance, in practice, this is on a total hip arthroplasty subjects compared to healthy controls. So they are perfectly matched by age and gender. 100 total hip arthroplasty patients, 1 to 2 years post-op, and controls. And you can see if you use a step count, so the normal activity parameter, there's no significant difference between these groups. So this is a too general, too simple, too conventional kind of aspect to differentiate these two groups. And based on that, you would say they are behaving the same. But already just looking at the distribution of these events gives us a totally different picture. We can see that if you look at the majority of bout duration, so events when walking takes place, you can see that in the walks that happen that last between 30 seconds and a minute, or 1 minute to 5 minutes, there is no difference. But you can see that there is a quite huge difference on longer than 5 minutes. So that means that the hip arthroplasty patients, they perform almost half as little long bouts over 5 minutes, so their exercise component is much less, but they also avoid the short bouts. So which is a very typical when you speak to clinicians, they will tell you that patients who are not perfectly recovered, they may avoid short events or stitch events together because it's an effort for them to maybe get out of a sitting or lying position. So you can see that by diving from a general parameter into the distribution, you can learn something about it. Here, this is actually a nice study that fits to the previous talk. Here we compared the outcome of patients perfectly matched from a huge database of more than 1,000 patients who have received either of the two implants for the same or comparable diagnosis. So you can see the left, the Oxford knee, so the unicompartmental knee replacement, and then the other side, the total knee replacement, where both condyles are replaced. And when you take the patient reports, both on function and activity, there's no difference, and that's typical. So these tools do not discriminate between these two procedures. But when you perform activity monitoring, and when you dive into very specific activities, like for instance the cadence, so how many steps per minute someone walks while walking, you can see that the patients with the unicompartmental knee replacement, they walk faster, and it's about 8 steps per minute with a minimal clinically significant difference of 5. So they are clinically significantly walking faster, and the biggest difference actually happens on the stairs, and that's what every joint replacement patient or meniscus patient or anterior cruciate ligament patient probably would say that managing stairs is the most demanding task after surgery. So we can see that here this method allows us to differentiate performance or outcome in a procedure which patient reports do not allow us. And this is another study which also fits nicely to this digital twin theme, because it shows what are actually the aspects that matter in real life wear of components. So here we measured from a very closely followed group. We selected subgroups of patients after hip replacement who had very low wear and those who had very high wear. So and you can see that the average is almost 3 times as high on the high wear group. And all the wear simulators that the industry standards provide, ASTM standards, all the labs, they are working on gate cycles. And they say, okay, this implant wears less because it has so much less wear on the gate cycle. But if you look in the real world, there's no difference in the step count. So normal walking seems not to affect wear. But if you look into detail, you can see again that the high wear group walks faster. And now we can see that the difference is 11 steps per minute. So that's 2 times the clinically minimum difference. That is faster. And again, they are the high wear group. They are performing twice as many short bouts. And if you transfer that into, let's say, a technical environment, it means like if you are walking continuously, the wear effect may be negligible. But if you walk fast or walk many short bouts, that's high wearing, similar to maybe like a car would wear down. Of course, this is a hypothesis that we have to validate, but it shows that this technique gives input into digital twin building. And this has been confirmed independently now by other groups and on other implants also. This was on polyethylene, and we have found similar aspects on metal bearings also. I will jump maybe some and show you some other interesting application using another device. So these are insoles, another wearable, where you can look the load that's carried after the operation. In this case, it's post-fracture surgery of the tibia, and you can see in this study the outcome was that patients do not follow the post-operative weight regime that the doctor says. So they say maybe 20% weight bearing the first week, 50% weight bearing the second week. They don't follow it. And the other thing is, it doesn't matter. So they cannot follow it, and the healing process and the outcome does not depend if they followed it or not followed it. This is quite revolutionary. In a way, it's paradigm shifting in terms of post-operative instructions. And here, this is something that I put on in the contents of the Parkinson expertise that's here in Luxembourg. This was a study where turning, which is a difficult task in Parkinson patients, was investigated, observed in the lab, and then in the real world. And you can see that in the lab, the fallers, they are not different from non-fallers, but in the real life, there's a huge difference in turning speed behavior. So again, we can identify what matters in a real scenario and can feed that into a digital trial, for instance. And I can also show that even when you use fitness trackers, so simple devices, or in this case, smartphone apps, and you generate big data. So in this case, 700,000 people, you can find out very interesting things. This is a paper even published in Nature, well, not from me, so this is another reference. But it shows that, for instance, when you compare cities of high and low walkability, that's an index of town building. Yeah? You can see that the behavior is totally different, especially in the morning, lunch break, and in the evening. But also you can differentiate highly the behavior during the weekday and the weekend. So we can really see that this assessment methods gives us insight. And they took it even further to show that in different countries there is different levels of inequality. So you can see, for instance, that not only in Saudi Arabia the total activity per step count is less, but it's also much more unequally distributed, meaning that the population does not benefit from the same level of exercise. Yeah? Only the wealthy people perform exercise, and the poor people, they miss out on this. Another very interesting application that shows you that it goes, that's the next step, it goes from wearables to implantables. So this is a group I'm collaborating with in Switzerland, the so-called AO Foundation. They have a strain gauge on a fracture implant where they can measure the bony deformation during loading, and as healing of the bony fracture occurs, the load transfer will go from the plate to the bone. So you can see that when healing appears in a sheep trial, you can see that the deformation on the plate goes down. And when there is a non-union developing, which is a very severe and common complication of bone healing, it's about like 10-15%, in patients has severe consequences, that you can detect this early and you may not need to take weekly x-rays. So you can save money, you can save radiation exposure, and this is now going into human trials. And what's interesting is they use an accelerometer only as an energy saving tool for the strain gauge. And of course I was interested in the acceleration signal because you can maybe deduct similar aspects just from the acceleration signal. So I like to summarize what we can do with this. We can do research with activity monitoring and use it, for instance, for input in vitro testing and in silico simulation, so by creating a digital twin. And there are many conferences and events that turn around this event or this kind of application. Then you can use it as a clinical trial endpoint to power evidence-based medicine and prove the treatment efficacy or label claims of certain medicine. Or in the context of digital twins, you can maybe do a digital trial because you can stratify patients in your digital trial as you would like, stratify for the inactive, active, for the intensely active and lowly active subjects. You can use it as a digital biomarker or for diagnosis, and there are even now journals popping out that are just focusing on this particular aspect. And that may be when you want to go into individual medicine or individual modeling of subjects where you need this kind of aspect. And that's something which is not necessarily digital twin related, but again, the application may generate input. You can feed the information back to the patient and coach the patient about therapy compliance, self-monitoring, and therefore maybe have an extra gain where the patient then again generates data that you can feed into your digital twin information. So there are various systems out. It's all just scratching the surface. I think they are trying to market something that's not yet developed, so the research community has to validate this, I think, in a proper way still. Of course, this has been a collaborative work, and these are the groups who I've been working with, and also who use my approach and algorithms to study different patient groups. And if anybody's interested, I'm welcome to collaborate, and thank you for your attention.
That was really fascinating. Thank you. Didn't know half of 10%. Is there any questions? Behind you should probably stand up and isolation.
I have, thank you for your talk, amazing. I have one question regarding the wear that you showed, because we looked a lot into that. And talking to David, he was telling me that they couldn't see any correlation between how much activities the patient would do regarding the wear or weight or anything. So they said we were like the same. And now you're saying is how fast they walk. So, and I guess, is that because of the polyethylene? Because now we have this rig and we could change like we can do 1 hour, so 2 hours, whatever. So we could change the speed. And is it because the heat generates when you wrap the polyethylene with is that?
I like the question. First, I also like this information. There is additional confirmation that the traditional input into simulation is not true. So also David in your group and David Murray agrees that the gate cycle, which if you look at the ASTM standards of wear testing, it's the Paul gate cycle that goes into it. So all the that are certified, approved, regulatory approved, they are tested on these machines, and it seems like it doesn't matter because it's all smooth, continuous, without interruptions. And I think and now that we have new tools, we are just discovering what matters. There may be more. We just see it's probably fast walking and it's probably interrupted walking. And if you think about tribology and lubrication, it makes sense. I think. So
I could use your.
I think that this would be. It would be a lovely study. It would be a lovely study to change the frequency. But what I think also what matters a lot is probably the interruption, especially on metal bearings, which rely on fluid film lubrication. When you interrupt fluid film. And I spoke with people developing wear test equipment. It's actually these kind of interruptions are not so easy to introduce in the protocols because these machines are hydraulically driven and they are more for continuous movement. And if you put these brakes, first the brakes expand the wear testing time, which the industry doesn't like, because they want to bring to. It's really interesting.
Then you can do more flexible. They are so expensive when you know you have to do tests there. It just it doesn't. So now we are.
Yes.
That's good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. I think there was another question. Sometimes you wonder. But yeah, so how do you think? So maybe I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that there are many small, not small, maybe large initiatives that are a bit disconnected. So how do you think that, practically speaking, that sort of data-driven health monitoring systems can be integrated in one, maybe overarching, organized, open, data protected, non-intrusive, ethically acceptable way? So what I mean? Because it seems like everybody's doing a lot of stuff, and I guess Apple, Microsoft, all these people, maybe not. I mean, Apple apparently their strategy is to come up with more gadgets so that you can be more instrumented. But then Facebook will use the gadgets to tell you who your next partner will be, or if you will commit suicide at the 57 or 44, I don't know. And then, so it seems to me many people are doing many things, and I have no idea what is the role of research in this. Yes.
I think this is a perfectly appropriate question, and maybe the holy grail that's pursued by different parties. And I think that because the discipline itself is relatively new, because it's technically enabled only relatively recently speaking in clinical research terms. So I think it's still a wild growth, a garden that grows wild. It's not yet a pruned garden. There's even when it comes to the taxonomy of the outcomes that you are measuring, the terminology that's behind it. So even when you talk about walking and a step, and it's not even something that appears so obvious. It's not really clearly defined. So and there are differences between devices. If sidestepping and shuffling is that counted towards as a step, or is it only when you are walking a minimum of a certain number of steps? So even on that level, which appears very obvious, so you can imagine when it comes to which parameter is more relevant and which device measures it reliably. So there's almost like a competition between people who use wrist-worn devices or belt-worn devices. So this is also a monitor. If I open this is not. I'm not pervert. Yeah. So this is. So this is a sensor that's worn in the belt, and it's close to the center of gravity or center of mass of the subject, which has certain advantages.
For energy.
For instance, exactly. And I mean, I told you I believe that the position of the leg, especially for lower extremity, is very important. So
then you could, I guess, correlate, because if you know the movement of this part and the movement of this part at the same time, you have a lot more information than if you know only this. Because maybe I'm moving like this, like I'm skating, but if I'm doing this, I'm certainly climbing stairs, and these two will be differently relative to one another.
You're totally right. We are in LIROMS in the CLINNOVA. We are developing a dual sensor monitoring device that exactly is looking into that would be a nice addition. Although, as I've shown, there is also beauty in the concept of being simplistic and only looking at a specific part of it and not trying to do everything. Because otherwise you are sacrificing. There's you can have either a lot of information on a high level, but that makes it very expensive and elaborate, or you generate it through a long period of time, through many days, and get a better representation of it and involve more subjects in it. But what your question is, where does it develop? So I think it's still they are still towers. So they are like, let's say, the big industry like Apple, Google, Microsoft, and so forth, who try to get into this health market. But I feel they are not necessarily driven, in my opinion, until now by the right motives. And then there are these researchers that are driven by a clinical question or an honorary motive. But I think there is a lot of, and there was just this conference in Maastricht, this biannual conference on this matter, and there was no representative of Google, Microsoft, Facebook was there, and they did not invite them. I mean, they did not invite them as a speaker. So I think this is a lost opportunity. I think forces need to be united. But what you can see is that there is a movement here. There was an EU call. It's called the IMI, Innovative Innovation in Medicines Initiative, and they had 2 calls from the FBIR. The FBIR is the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry, and then these consortium are the pharma companies and Microsoft, Google, and so forth, and they are now in the game of trying to validate outcomes based on wearables, and these are big studies that are funded with 40-50 million each.
Yeah, because my feeling as a completely non-knowledgeable person about this is that there is a lot of lost opportunities in the ability to analyze the data that is there. So, for example, if you're doing sports, many people are on things like Strava.
Yes.
And so you can monitor everything: the heart rate, the pace, the number of steps per minute, the speeds, the everything.
Yes.
And you have also on the bike all sorts of other sensors that you can use. And all this data is absolutely not used. So, but for a sports person, it would be hugely helpful to know, when you're, especially if you're not a professional, you don't have a coach, your goal is to reach your maximum level, but you don't know what makes it work for your body. But then all this information could analyze your past experience and tell you in that place you were the most performant ever with your whole training, let's say career, and then post the back analyze and say, okay, this is what led to this performance. And if you try to replicate this in the future, maybe there is a hope that you reach that performance again, or maybe you exceed that performance. And I'm very surprised that they are not using this yet.
Yeah,
I think the tools are there.
Yes.
It's just people don't do it. I don't understand because it's a huge gap that seems obvious to fill, and I don't really get it. Why?
This is another. I agree. This is another interesting thing, and this is a little bit what was in this Nature paper. So I think the relevance is so that there are these apps or the commercial devices that collect a lot of data. Maybe not in a validated way. I mean these. If you use these sports wearable device and you really clinically validate, you have quite an error that maybe in a lab no one would accept. But because you generate here millions, so the error, the individual error, is compensated by the big data. So this is not what I mean. There's always a trade-off between small numbers and very precise, or big numbers and not so precise, and what gives you more insight. And I think you need both, because you need the detail and the big picture. And access to such data platforms such as Strava or Fitbit, that would be good. And I think that they are themselves too commercially driven to analyze it yet for research purposes. Or as researchers, we may have to apply to have a collaborative agreement like these people did. So this study was performed based on a group in Berkeley, and they have collaborated with this smartphone app provider to get access to the data. That would be maybe a project for people like us to write a proposal to Strava, for instance, to get access to the data and run models about it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we have to stop.
Of course.
Thank you again for your very exciting talk.
Thank you.
We're running very late, but it's okay. So our next speaker is Caroline Mouton, from this same place, but talking about a different topic, which is the. Can you reach that tool? Yes. Okay. So now other problem of connection. Anybody has a?
No, maybe on
trans. You have HDMI here. Alright.
Can you use this? USB-C on this.
Do you have USB-C here? Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's very nice. Alright. So now is that starting now? Maybe I need to press
Yeah.
Then maybe transfer it on the computer.
Ah, yeah, okay. You want to install it on my computer? Yeah. But then I need this thing. Wait a second. Because I don't have it used for the classic USB port, but you can do it, of course.
So sorry.
Okay. Right.
But I can start.
You can start. Okay.
It's being prepared even if I don't have the slides. So I will speak more about the clinical actually aspect here about ACL injuries, but I will speak also about meniscus injuries because it happens a lot in ACL. And I think it's nice to have these talks because it will show how clinical relevant our previous talk, because all the research that we've seen before, they are really useful to us in the clinic, because our final aim, I think, for everybody is really to enhance and improve patient care, and at the end that the patient has a nice quality of life. Unfortunately, as I will show a bit of how we handle anterior cruciate ligament injuries and the patient registry we have within the department, you will see that actually I will bring even more factors into the equation, and I will maybe make the picture even more complex than the previous talk. So, yeah.
There we are, very good.
So I'm a scientific coordinator of the Department of the Musculoskeletal Disease at the Centre Hospitalier in Luxembourg, who is headed by Romain Zeil, an orthopedic surgeon, who unfortunately could not be here today. If I go first through sports injuries, because this is what we mostly do, you have to know that there is about 0.5% of sports-related benefits that are lost because of sports injuries or disease. So most of sports or athletes get injured once in their life. It's 78 billion of euros that are expended each year for sports injuries, and it's almost 8% of the European Union healthcare budget, without considering long-term costs that sports injuries may have. And it's actually a budget that is comparable to neurodegenerative disease. If you look closer at sports injuries, most of the sports injuries involve the lower limb. The knee is the most affected joint, and it's also the most common body part affected by severe injuries. When we speak about severe injuries, that means at least 4 weeks not being on the field and being stopped totally from playing sports. If we look then at anterior cruciate ligament injuries, we know that in the last 2 decades it has increased by 1.3% each year, and it's the injury also that has the highest direct cost, because it's minimum 6 to 12 months of care actually after that kind of injury. And I had the data from somebody from Stockholm. If we know from FIFA that there is 265 million soccer players in the world, and we can estimate that it makes 5 million injuries, ACL injuries per year. So what are ACL injuries and how do we handle them from a clinical point of view? So when you get this injury, you will have first muscle weakness, mainly on the quadriceps. Patients may experience instabilities or giving way, so they don't feel like they can trust the knee. And of course this injury is depending, so some people are more risky than others, so we will see this. Then you have to go through the diagnosis, then you have to choose the treatment. The main question is, should we get surgery or not? Then you have at least 6 months of rehabilitation usually before being allowed to return to the field. This rehabilitation, to evaluate the progress, you do regular evaluation, and then there is the question of, can I let my patient go back to sports, and regarding which criteria and what are the risks that the athletes may enter. So our main question is, at the moment, which treatment is the best for which patient and for which type of injury, which actually we don't have any answer yet. And you will see, because it's very complex and there are many factors. So if I go back a bit on anatomy, so the anterior cruciate ligament is here, inserted on the anterior part of the tibia and going to be inserted behind the femur. And actually the structure is actually already quite complex because many people say that there are 2 bundles, even some discuss about 3 bundles within the ligament, so they don't have the same properties. And we know their insertion, we know the size they have, we have a bit of idea of the anatomy. The anterior cruciate ligament, what is important to know is that it is the primary restraint to the anterior tibial displacement, so if you push the tibia forward, then it will restrain, the ACL will restrain 80% of the force. And it's also the secondary restraint to knee rotation. And the surgery, the primary aim of the surgery is to restore this knee anatomy and biomechanics. But actually it's not only about the ACL in the knee, there are many structures actually. And all of these structures may influence the different direction where the knee goes. And this is where it's starting to be very complex. And I will show you, I'm not sure it's working here, but I have the video. So what is an ACL injury? Maybe this one. So this is Owen in England that got this ACL injury. And you see when it just lands on his knee, the foot is a bit external. And you will see the tibia going. At the moment, it's moving. There is kind of a subluxation of the knee. And this is what is an ACL injury. So there are many mechanisms that we know. But knowing how it occurs actually helps us also during the diagnosis. So from national registries, what we know is that it's mainly sporting injuries occurring in sporting activities, mostly non-contact injuries, as you saw in the previous video, so no contact with other player. Actually, you just have a sudden change of movement and you need just get injured. We know the incidence per inhabitants per year. And actually we know that some people, depending on their age, have higher incidence to get injured. And actually, if you just check how many inhabitants there is in Europe and in Luxembourg, we can say that there is at least 215 ACL surgeries in Luxembourg per year. And I'm just speaking about surgeries, which means that some patients don't get surgeries, but we don't know how exactly the numbers of patients that would be represented by this. Risk factors, there are many. We usually divide it into 2, the intrinsic, so dependent of the person, and the extrinsic factors. And there are some that we consider as non-modifiable, so we cannot, this is like this and we cannot do anything on it, and some others that are modifiable. So for example, sex, age, genetic, we cannot have an influence on this, but we can still train the patient to have a better control of his muscles, movement quality to avoid any injuries. And of course there is all this intrinsic weather competition, playing surface shoes that may interfere also and create the injury. This is a model that was created 12 years before that explains a bit how an injury may occur. So you have a predisposed athlete, so there is all the intrinsic parameters, and he gets on the field, so he may be susceptible to get an injury. And sometimes he will be close to events, but maybe 3 times out of 4 he will never get injury and will repeat the participation. And sometimes maybe, unfortunately, he will get injured. And this is how it happens. And in the case of injury, so who gets injured in ACL, from our patient register, we have published about patient, what we have called patient profile. And what you can see is that if you check in gray here, in females, it's mostly patients below 20. And then there is a second peak above 35, unfortunately mostly ski injuries in this case. And for men, you have a high peak of injury from maybe 15 to 30 years old. mainly football injuries in men. And of course, this patient profile, that will depend on gender, age, and pre-injury level of activity, as I just explained. So if you get an injury, how does it happen when you see the doctor? Few doctors actually know it, but there is, most of injuries have a typical mechanism, and just knowing how the injury happened may already orientate to ACL diagnosis. So usually without context, there is this knee torsion with valgus and rotation of the knee. The patient often reports a kind of pop that he heard in his knee, and is not able to walk anymore after, and has swelling and pain within 4 hours. And this is kind of typical of ACL injuries. And unfortunately, the diagnosis requires experience, because when we see data from emergency rooms in Europe, only 7 to 25% of injuries are already diagnosed at the first medical visit. There are some patients that wait 8, 12 months to get this diagnosis. Why? Because when you go to the emergency room, first you have to do X-rays. So this is the standard care, but X-rays are important to first check that there is no fracture. But then they let you leave the hospital saying you have nothing. There is nothing on the radio, on the X-ray. But actually they don't consider all the soft tissue that are around the knee. So this is why usually you get MRI also to assess associated lesion. The doctor will manipulate your knee to see the stability, so there are some stability tests to know. And we can do also a laxity test that I will just show you. These are 2 devices we have at the clinic. And we have actually worked on combining these 2 devices to actually have a diagnosis in 10 minutes, which is as efficient as MRI, but you don't have the waiting time of MRI. So we have developed this, and we have chosen some threshold to be able to detect as many or differentiate as most as we can healthy people from patients with ACL injury. This device, we use them also to follow the patient after the injury, because actually, so as it's a laxity test, so we push the tibia forward, and I told you that the ACL is the primary restraint to anterior displacement. So what we do is that usually we do a test just after the injury, or as soon as there is no pain anymore in the knee. We apply a force behind the knee. There is a small displacement in millimeters. And we know that here it's typically an ACL injury because there is a huge difference between both knees. But then we repeat this test. For example, after surgery. So in this case, the second time both knees were here. So the surgery went well. We have stabilized the laxity of the knee. And then the patients come back at 12 months after the injury, and we see again this increase. Knowing that she has returned to sport between 6 months and 12 months, and this thing is happening, this laxity is increasing, maybe that something is going wrong actually with the surgery, and maybe she has returned to sport too early. We have done some other things with laxity test. We have assessed a lot of healthy knees on healthy controls actually, to be able, because as the knee is in 3 directions, these 3 dimensions, to be able to have some laxity profiles also, which is specific parts of interest. Also checking and finding that patients, usually the healthy knee, they have already higher laxity than healthy controls, and actually laxity is thought to be a risk factor to get ACL injuries. And knowing that they have more laxity makes sense in this case. What about ACL injuries and how complex they are? There are not one type of lesion. There are some that are partial, one bundle only, some that are complete, so several times. And there are specific cases of children where there are only bony avulsions. This means that it's not the ligament itself being injured, it's just a part of the bone that's at the attachment on the tibia that just maybe change a bit. And to discuss about associated lesions, and this may go back to the discussion with the root here, that if you remind the video of Michael Owen getting injured with this tibia that goes forwards, most of the time the tibia is pushed forwards during the injury. And there is this meniscus that is sometimes totally extruded in the back. And this is why actually we have a lot of meniscal injury in the posterior horn actually. Associated injuries, they are not helping for the diagnosis because some of them may create a false negative during the test, and they may also influence on knee stability. And the problems the surgeons have is that the less stable the knee is when he sees the patient, the more surgery we have to do, and the more difficult it will be also to normalize the patient after. And this is a graph, so a graph that shows about the type of injury you can have. We think that the higher the trauma is, and the more structure you will get injured. So the partial ACL tear, most of the time we can handle them conservatively. Then you get complete ACL, and sometimes you have one meniscus tear, sometimes you have both meniscus having a tear, sometimes you have multi-ligament injuries, so not only one ligament being injured, so the picture is quite complex. And coming back on associated meniscal injuries, so this is from different registers, including the one we have at the hospital. We actually see only 1 patient out of 4 having an isolated ACL injury. 2 patients out of 3 have an associated meniscal injury. So they have to be handled also when we're thinking about ACL reconstruction. So meniscus, it has been presented before. Several types of tears exist actually, so this is not actually a complete, even if we have 2 or 3 more since 4 years, type of tears. When the surgeon sees this, what he will do is that he will assess if the tear is stable, its length, its location, its complexity, and he will decide what kind of treatment he can do. So there are 3 possibilities. If the tear is stable, not big, then he may left in situ and have no surgical intervention on it. He may repair it or remove partially or totally the meniscus. We are trying to save the meniscus, never remove a meniscus if it can be repaired, because the meniscus is absorbing the shock, and if you remove the meniscus, you know that a few years after you will have arthrosis, and you may go to prosthesis. So as soon as you have a meniscus that can be repaired, we're trying to save it. So this was for the meniscus. For the ACL, surgery or not? Well, the clinical decision will depend on age, on the activity level the patients want to go back to, the associated lesions, because normally if there is a meniscus, then you prefer to do both at the same time, and the knee instability from objective point of view, but also from the patient point of view, because some patients, they just feel that they are not stable. And this is data from our register, where we had a look at the different profiles of patients we had, and we tried to understand what kind of patient we mostly operate. And this is on the left side, so every man, competitive sports below 35 years old, and women also, so involved in competitive sports before, 9 of 10 of them will be operated. But for this category of patients, so recreational sports, more than 35 years old, many actually ski injuries, unfortunately, only half of the patients will need surgery, because most of them can cope without surgery. The surgery itself, many factors to understand. So actually before, until 13 years ago, we were still opening fully the knee. Now we have arthroscopes, we have cameras that we can enter into the knee. So it's actually quite new, and several techniques developing. And we have 3 graft options to reconstruct the knee. So sometimes we use the hamstrings behind the thigh. It can be actually folded in 3, 4, or 5 strands, so there is actually 3 types of graft already. Sometimes you use the patella tendon, and sometimes the quadriceps. You can decide to do a double bundle reconstruction, because if we want to see it anatomically, there is 2 bundles. You can do only a second bundle reconstruction, or partial reconstruction in case of a partial tear. You have, again, also other possibilities. Sometimes you have a remnant which is not functional within the knee, and you want to preserve the remnant because you think that in the remnant there is still some vascularization and it will help healing. And mainly in the USA, they use also sometimes allograft. The most important factors about this will be the graft size, which is something we cannot control. So we open patient, and you don't know actually how it will be the patient dependent. So, but we know that if the graft size is not big enough, then you have greater risk of failure after the surgery. Then you have the possibilities of different implants and techniques. So these are some implants we can use. There are two main categories. Here, this is a screw. This is intraosseous, so we fix within the bone. Or you have what we call extracortical implants, where actually you just draw a tunnel. There is nothing within the tunnel except the graft, and you fix it outside. Here, the problem in the technical part of the surgery is the tunnel size, because actually the tunnel size may increase 2 years after or 5 years after, because the bone is getting injured. The position, because you want to be anatomic to replace the ACL root it was before, and also the orientation of the tunnel. Because if you orientate, for example, like this, you have biomechanical problem in the patient. So you have some way to place the tunnel that is quite known. And there is still the specificity of children, because children, they still are able to grow. They have the open physis. And actually in children, what you have to be careful is not actually to injure. Because if you injure the physis, then you can cause arrest. So you have to have adapted techniques for children, because you have many problems that may be possible. Other options, 2 years maybe ago, there was this huge discussion about the anterior lateral ligament, which has been discovered, which is actually not discovered, maybe rediscovered, because it was written 200 years ago. There are many surgeons that use a reconstruction of the anterior lateral ligament in case of a very unstable knee. Because actually when you see its insertion, we can understand quite easily that it's also controlling the rotation. So in highly unstable knee, we may have these options. In case of several revisions, so the patient comes for an ACL injury unfortunately for the second or the third time, it sometimes happens, you may consider associated surgery like osteotomies. So this is also what we propose before the unique computational knee prosthesis. So to be as conservative as possible, when you can actually, so you cut here a triangle, and you can actually replace the bone, so to have something that may be less risky for the patient. And here it was, so there was a previous, and you can see the tunnel actually that were formed here on the tibia. So these are all the options we have for the surgery. So it's already, if you want to study the outcomes of the patient, just imagine how many factors we need to take into account and how many patients you need to recruit to have something that will be significant at the end. Then you go to rehabilitation and evaluation. So rehabilitation is regardless of the treatment. If you get surgery or not, usually it's at least 6 months. And you can have standardized, as we did in the clinic, standardized evaluation of the patient, and then start to discuss about the return to sports. Rehabilitation, it will depend on associated lesions and surgical intervention. For example, if you have a meniscal repair at the same time of the ACL surgery, then you are not always allowed to, actually you have to wear a splint. You are not allowed to move your knee like you want, so it actually delayed the rehabilitation. But anyway, it should start even before surgery. And after, there are 3 main phases. So the first phase for the physio will be to diminish the joint swelling and pain, to restore this full range of motion of the knee, and to let the patient be able to work and do his activities. It can take 4 to 6, or I would say even 6 to 2 months, depending on the patient. A second will be to increase the quadriceps strength, to normalize also the stability of the patient, and to have muscular training. This can go up to 6 months or 4 or 5 months maybe. And then you start to do sport-specific exercise, to do hop tests also to test the patient. And this is what rehabilitation is about. It's very long for the patient. It's quite, 6 months is often difficult. But at any time, actually, this rehabilitation may be delayed by symptoms experienced by the patient. So pain, giving way, swelling, weakness of the muscle, many things may happen. and to analyze the progress of the rehabilitation, you want to have evaluation. So this is almost all evaluation we are proposing. So from questionnaires, so patient-reported outcomes, hop test, strength, muscle force, laxity test, stability test, even movement analysis, so to check the quality of the movement. So there are several aspects we are trying to assess to have a big picture of the patient. About the return to sports, so we actually divided, so when we start to discuss actually about this with the patient, you have the return to participation, where you just return to rehabilitation, training, return to sports. He may go back to his sports, for example, football, but not playing at the same level he was doing before. And then return to performance is really like the patient has returned to the same sports and at the same level he was performing before. And all this decision is actually full of factors because you have to take into account the functional test, the symptoms, the type of sports that the patient is playing, because maybe some types of sports are more risky than others, the position played. Because if you're a goalkeeper in football, then it's different than if you are really running the entire thing. But also the pressure from the outside. The coach may have pressure also on the athletes to go back to the sports. The family sometimes, and there are many things we are trying to assess at the same time. From a functional point of view, at the physiotherapy department, we are based on this criteria that the difference between both knees or both legs should be actually lower than 10%. So lower symmetry index superior to 90%. It actually was written somewhere in the literature, everybody used this, but we don't know why it is this threshold. So everybody used this, but without any really scientifically evidence-based medicine behind. We know that the more we delay the return to sports, the more we decrease also the re-injury rate for the patient. So we want to delay as far as we can, which is not always possible. And coming back on this 10% difference between both knees, these are results from our registry, so from pre-surgery to 12 months after surgery for two types of grafts. And so I told you, we would say, okay, for this criteria, you can return to sport if you have less than 10%. And in gray are the patients, so the green zone, are the patients that have less than 10%. Just check here, how many patients here have less than 10%? So actually we request something for patients, but we don't have data on the reality. And we cannot, many patients are coming back to sports at 6 months, but actually the criteria that are written in the literature are far from what we really observe in the reality actually. This is a problem we have, which is why we have started also to observe what is happening, so just observational, and started to establish normative reference for several, so we're starting test after test. This for the patient outcome, so this is just an example, and we're trying to see, okay, what is the natural history of our patient? And knowing this, then we can directly in the clinic now identify the patient with the lowest score and maybe try to see case by case if we can improve their care. But we are still far from being really scientific or taking into account several parameters. The return to sports, well, actually, it's also a problem. Only 55% are returning to competitive level sport after surgery. It's very, very few. This is from a meta-analysis. And there are many reasons also for not returning to sport, because you may want to see just, are my patients coming back to sports, but they're maybe not returning to sports for other reasons than just sports. There are some personal factors, situational factors, sometimes the fear of re-injury, sometimes you just had a baby, you just don't want to go back to sports. And this is a factor that you have to take into account. But anyway, if the patients return to sports or not, you will have short and long-term risk. For some athletes, it's an end of career. It's a social handicap, mostly I would say for below 18, because playing football in the streets with your friends is quite funny, and then you're just stuck and staying at home, not playing your sports again. Many patients, if they don't get surgery, they fear sometimes that their knee will dislocate again. if you will have risk for secondary meniscal cartilage lesion, sometimes secondary ACL injury also, and you will have anyway, as soon as you have the injury, the ACL injury, 10 years after you will have half of patients already having the first sign of arthrosis. And just imagine that if you have a 15-year-old athlete, at 25 years old, he has the knee of somebody being already 50 years old. And what should we do? Because we cannot go to the knee prosthesis, it's too soon.
So, wait for my meniscus.
Yeah. If the meniscus is okay, we keep it. Secondary ACL injury, if you're less than 25 years old, if you do the ACL injury before you're 20, being 20 years old, we know that 1 patient out of 4 will come for re-injury, either the same side or the other side. This is the very risky population. And of course, all this compromises the integrity of the long-term knee function, the quality of life of the patient, because we speak about direct costs, medical costs, but will these people be able to work at 40, depending on the work they are doing? What will be the quality of life when they retire? And of course, if you want to go back to high-level sports, then it's really compromised. And this is a slide from Roman Zeil, the head of the department, which I found really nice because it showed you the treatment cascade and what might happen just after the injury. So you get the injury, then you may have repair surgery, then you may use actually painkillers, whatever that, so be the most conservative that you want to be. But then the reality is that you may go to osteotomies first, and then may get a unique compartmental prosthesis, then a complete prosthesis, and it can go even further if there are any complications. So this, when you're 15 years old, you just have to make the calculation by yourself. So just to go to a summary and maybe to the conclusion and go after for the data things. Maybe that ACL injury have similar injury mechanism, but all patients are different, all injuries are different. I've showed it to you. There are many different treatment and surgery possible. And of course, because of all these factors, the outcome is different. And at the moment, we don't know how to predict. So we don't know actually. A patient that comes, we cannot say to him, okay, we're sure you're going back to sports. We cannot predict his outcome, which is a big problem. So of course, we're trying to, with the surgeon experience, we're trying to adapt the treatment every time to patient and injury, and to assess the risk of each athlete and patient. And if you want to have the big pictures, so this represents everything I have presented to you, from the athletes that that participate in sports, that got the injury, that after medical care may return to sport and re-enter actually the loop. But anyway, there will be new injuries and long-term consequences. And at any time, it's not an exhaustive list, but any of these factors that I've presented to you may actually interfere. And actually, the profile of the patient is changing every month because the factors may change also from a month to another. So it's very evolutive thing, and it's really difficult to predict. We have solutions to study ACL injuries. So you know about clinical studies, randomized controlled trial, but of course these are controlled environment. And most of the time what I see in the orthopedics literature and frequently is that there is low external validity. So what the other authors showed, we cannot use it for us. We cannot make a general use of it. There are national registries, where mainly in orthopedics are the Scandinavian, United Kingdom's registries and some private insurance in the United States. Has a big societal impact. It's usually complete, so you have the entire number of cases being entered, so it's good for epidemiology. But of course, if you have a national registry, then there is really limited numbers of factors that are studied. So sometimes there is just a surgery report and some outcomes, but you don't have the full picture of the patient. And most of the time, the problem we have at the moment is that it only includes patients with ACL reconstruction. So all those that don't have any reconstruction, we don't know what happens to them. And we have, and this is a solution that we decided to take, the center-based registry, so we can collect greater diversity of data. Of course, the weakness is that it can take longer time to obtain a high number of cases, depending on the center you are working on. So we have chosen this hospital-based registry, so some strengths here in Luxembourg, multidisciplinary team, because we're working, so I'm a scientist actually directly working in the department with surgeons. We have a prospective collection, we have more than 1,000 variables per follow-up per patient, knowing that we have now more than 1,000 patients, also 1,500, I think, patients that agreed to give their data for research, so with the ethical committee consideration, all those things. We can analyze a huge numbers of aspects, and we also include non-operated patients. But there are still some weakness, because there are still some aspects that we do not integrate, like psychological aspects. We have, of course, a lower recruitment rate than national registries, and we don't have any predictive model to assess at the moment future risk. But there are many opportunities with that kind of registries, that we can go through personalized medicine. We can have also plenty of publication, external collaboration, and start to create risk profiles. And many threats also about this, mainly financial. Unfortunately, we don't have much money going for clinical research. So actually, I'm the only one doing research in the department and dealing with this, which means that I have to to say to the clinician, okay, I'm trying to make you work the less possible, but I need you to get me some data. So they have in their clinical practice to integrate some report and give me some data if you want to go. The clinical reality also is quite difficult, because the quality of data is difficult to standardize, because each patient is different. So even if you build the software and the models, you will have a new case that you don't know where to put it, actually, where to put the patient in, because it's evolving, the classification are evolving. For example, meniscal tears, we have new tears that we discussed about since 2 years ago. So we have to add it in the software. And we have the problem in orthopedics, mainly also as in many fields, that there are some definitions that lacking of consensus in the literature, like not everybody is assessing return to spot the same way, depending on the center. So making this presentation makes me think about, well, we should go to data-driven simulation. We have a huge database now of data. We can add some tests like sensors, like also this. And there is actually big pictures with many, many factors. And actually, I think all this may help one day, because this is the relevant question we have in the clinic. Which treatment is the best for which patient and which injury? When surgery should be considered and will provide the best outcomes? When is the risk the lowest for return to sports, according to my patient profile? And what is the risk of my patient to have a new injury or to require further medical care? These are just examples, but the possibilities are just, I think, huge in the future. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the talk. I realize we are at the end of the coffee break, so you did not notice that yet, but we are. And your body did not notice the caffeine input either, which is a negative thing. So to compensate, I suggest we take the questions during the walking time to the coffee break, which is 20 paces away. Take the coffee, come back, and have the next talk immediately, so that you have the caffeine intake and the discussions along the 20 times 2 paces to the coffee break and back. So we can have a spur of...
To understand the brain, at least part of it, and to adapt to this audience here, so I put the subtitles there so that we do that in a data-driven fashion. So the overall strategy of our lab is that we try to integrate across the different scales. So, and then this is the most challenging thing in the brain, because probably the brain is the most complex entity in the universe, and so that's why there's also this 1 billion project of the EU to try to understand, so what is the brain actually doing. And this large complexity is already can be seen by these 2 numbers here, so that the brain consists about 100 billion neurons, or 100 billion nerve cells, and each of these nerve cells has about 1,000 to 10,000 connections to its neighbors. So in addition to that one, so if you look into now a very small subset of the brain, so this is less than 1 millimeter, here you see that these neurons are tightly together, and you see that they're building something like this, a sponge where they can talk to each other. But the brain is even more complex because we do not only have our neurons, but in addition, there are other cell types in the brain. So where the neuron is the most known one, but then you have also astrocytes that are the mediators between the blood vessel and the neuron. So because the astrocytes take up the sugar from the blood, do a little bit of metabolism, and then providing more high potential substrates to the neurons. Then there's another one, so the oligodendrocyte that's actually doing the insulation of the axons, so where the neurons communicate with each other, and if you have a problem with these cells, you end up with MS. And then we have the microglia cells, and these are the immune cells of the brain, so the brain has its own immune system, and they are screening the environment, and if there's something bad or a dying neuron, they will go there and eat it up. And this is also something where at the end of my talk I will come to, because it has also a potential role in neurodegeneration. So then, due to recent technology, so we can now dissect this heterogeneity of the brain in more detail. What you can see here, so which is now only about 100,000 cells of a human brain, and then you characterize them based on the program that is activated. And then you see here in orange, and green, you see the neurons, right? So the cells that we are thinking with. And then you see also the astrocytes here as in the lower left button. So maybe I should teach the cursor. Okay, maybe not. As well as the oligodendrocyte and the microglia. And so this is now very much a state of the art, that we can look into the cellular heterogeneity of the brain, and there's just another billion coming up, which is a project, the Lifetime. So this is supposed to be the new flagship EU project, where they want to spend 1 million to dissect diseases at single cell resolution, and luckily Luxembourg has also a little toe in there to try to shape this together with Klaus Vögele from Berlin. So as said, so my major interest is to understand what's going wrong in diseases in the brain. For this one, so in systems biomedicine, we have this holy grail to connect the genotype, so meaning your DNA content, then with the phenotype, which can be then either your cellular characteristics or then the clinical phenotype, as you have, for instance, the neurodegeneration, the Parkinson's thing that we have to promote at the LCSB always, or also in epilepsy things that I will talk about. And the general idea, the question is here, how does genetic risk factors that we can obtain by sequencing, so on a very small scale, how do they translate then to the clinical phenotype within the brain? So today I want to tell you a little bit how we can try to understand things here in terms of epilepsy, so where we have no more than 500 genes, but I will specifically talk about one gene here that is leading to this epileptic seizures. And then I will give you one example, Alzheimer-based, how genetic risk factors can manifest into the clinical phenotype. So to do this, or to characterize what's going wrong in the brain, so we look into cells, and we can do this, for instance, by microscopy here, and you see here the three main structures, so where we have the information, so your DNA, somewhere in the nucleus, and then to keep the cell going, so you need energy, so then this is done by mitochondria, and you need the structure, so your cytoskeleton, as the biologists call it, and we can visualize this on the one hand by microscopy or general imaging approaches, so as this picture was taken, but this will only tell you so far so that there is a nucleus where your DNA is in. So now the recent developments do allow us now to see a little bit more closer into this information, and how we do this is by this droplet-based approach. So where you see here a microfluidics device that is generating 1 million of these droplets in a minute. And then what you do with these droplets, you can now load individual cells with a bead into this droplet, and the bead has a unique barcode. So with this unique barcode, you now capture the activated genes, and then, because this unique barcode tells you the origin of your cell, in the end you can then put everything together in this fancy sequencer, And what you then get is that you get for thousands of cells, you get 10,000 activated genes, or you can measure the activation of up to 20,000 genes. So, which is a rather powerful tool, and this is how this cellular heterogeneity of the brain is at the moment tackled. So, starting with the neurons. So, the neuron is a special cell with a special need. And in the first approximation, you can consider this as a receiver, processing, sending element, where in the upper part you have the dendrites, they're called. So these are the antennas where they sense the environment, so these are the neurons. Then the information is integrated in the soma, in the cell body, and then based on decision making, it's then signaled to the next neuron, to the neighbors at the synapse, where you have then these neurotransmitters, right? So glutamate and GABA are the most important things. So just gluta, GABA, I will come back to that later. And to do this, so the neurons have very high energy demands, right? So because they have to be very active to generate these electric impulses with which they're signaling. And the neuron typically have also a very specific morphology. So if you would be a neuron in terms of the cell body, so then your little toe would be somewhere, well, Mersch or something like that, right? So that's why you have to transport everything that you need at the synapse for signaling. You have to transport from here to Mersch, and well, you know the traffic in Luxembourg, right? So this can sometimes be really, really hard. And all these things then sum up together that if you're at resting level, so not doing sports and injure your knee, but just lay in bed, you still use 2/3 of your energy you need to keep a homeostasis of your neurons, right? To build up ion gradients and to keep the neuron happy. So, and approximately this is about 50 watts. So meaning you're as bright as 50 watts light bulb. So our understanding, so what neuron is doing, right? So it's taking some input and is then integrating that to generate an output. So typical input-output relation, and the main readout that we look at is the voltage. And then there has been these famous experiments from Hodgkin and Huxley measuring squat, and with that they came up with this famous Hodgkin-Huxley model, which is for me the first Nobel Prize for systems biology. So because they really took a specific system, analyzed it carefully, and generated some mass from it. And you see, so with this model, you generate this typical spike frequency of a neuron. And the Nobel Prize was given for that even before they knew what we know today, they could come up with this regulatory mechanism inside the neuron that we know now is about the ion channels. Yeah? So, but those days, they knew that there are ion channels, but they didn't know how they work. But with this mathematical thing, they could dissect it. And as you see here in the lower panel, so this is a little nice oscillator. Actually, so Heraclid, this is Panther racing, so that everything is floating in life and in nature, is actually a little bit more that everything is oscillating. Okay, so now we have a little bit insight into a single neuron, that the brain is, as I said, so consists of about 100 billion of this one. And to keep the balance there between activation and inhibition, so there are these two main neurotransmitters, meaning the substance that is exchanged from the sender, so the presynaptic neuron as we call it, to the postsynaptic neuron, where glutamate is the activation signal, so I activate you, and GABA is an inhibitory thing, inhibitory signal. So meaning if you do not want to get overexcited, so you have to balance your excitation always with GABA. If you want to be still active enough to react, so you have to compensate with the glutamate. And as you will see, so this has actually then also something to do with epilepsy, where we do not try to understand at the moment the 100 billion human cells, but we go to a smaller model system, so the zebrafish. And this is a cool model system because, first of all, it's not as complex as we, so it's a good thing if you want to understand something. So because it has only about 100,000 to 1 million neurons, And the nice thing is it's transparent. Or some of these things are transparent, meaning that with a microscope you can actually look into the fish and into the brain and try to monitor what's going to happen. So as said, we use this as a model for epilepsy, and here you can see a behavioral readout. So here is a lazy white type guy. Now if you have a fish with epilepsy, so meaning it's hyperactive, so then you see this hyper brain activity also in its movement, right? So this is a nice thing that is also used for drug screening, where you then now could put different substances to this fish and see if this is cut down. Then this may guide you to some new medical treatment. What we also can do with this fish, that we can do a fish EEG. So where this EEG probably you don't want to get it, because what you do in this EEG is that you take a needle and you peek it into the brain. Okay. But still, we can then measure the local field potential, and then you see that we can measure this seizure behavior, which is shorter than in humans, but has the same characteristics as in humans. And how do we measure that one? So this is now mainly experimental work from Alice that I present. So we have this setup here where we have a microscope and then the needle that we put into the fish thing, and then you can see here under control condition the brain is not so bright, not so active, whereas if you put an epilepsy drug on it, so you get activation and you see a little bit of this noisy brain activity there. So, and our starting point was then, now we can take time course data from these different conditions, and then you see that in the control condition, brain activity is rather flat, whereas if you put this drug in there, we can induce these epileptic seizures, and with a little bit more analysis, it seems that there is a critical threshold where you end up with a seizure when you cross that. So we can also have a side view to the zebrafish. Now what you see here is, in the front you see the brain, then the pulsing thing is the heart, the very bright thing is the swim bladder, and all the rest is more or less brain. What you see here, and then you see that there is this synchronous firing of neurons, so shown by the bright lightning. And you can then look into what's going on in the fish. And then you can do either automatically or hand-drawn region of interest, and actually then you see that this correlated dynamics within the brain actually corresponds also to brain areas, right? So because the brain has different areas, so like the cortex with which we are thinking, so that's the midbrain, and so on, and the same is true for the zebrafish. The first thing that we had to establish is then that there's, from this imaging-based thing, so this is a direct correlation to the seizure. We measure with the needle, with the EEG. Nicely done. And the advantage of this imaging-based thing is that we can now look into spatial correlation. So it means that we can try to understand from where the seizure is generated and then spreading out to the brain. And for this one, you can now do a brain correlation map, so where the different areas are tagged, and then you look into the correlation, and we see, for instance, there that the hindbrain here, so it does not have a strong connection compared to the more forebrain connections. So this is how we look into seizures, and then I want to briefly talk about a specific mutation, so the SDN1A, which is an ion channel, so meaning that it allows ions to cross the membrane of the neuron. And if you have a mutation in humans, so this is actually associated with a very severe form of epilepsy, so it's Dravet syndrome. And also, if you now mutate this channel in the fish, you see also that you have a strong increase of epileptic seizures that you then can treat with some drugs that are also applied to humans. So then from this one you can also now do EEGs, and then you see that actually the mutation is actually leading to an increase in your amplitude, the EEG amplitude. But the critical question that we address here, and this is work in collaboration with Georges Gonsalves and Laurent Momberts, who defended this thesis yesterday, is now to predict, first to identify and predict seizures from EEG data. Yeah? So which looks here like well, if you know where it is, it's easy to detect, but we have the problem that there are also a lot of other signals that you have to discern from it. So what is also visualized here, where these are now 6 individual seizures. In this box, you see seizures from different fish. And you see, so there's a large variability, but even within one fish, the seizure can have different forms, right? So now meaning that there's not just an easy threshold thing that you could apply, because you have to consider more of these dynamical features to identify a specific seizure. And so Laurent did excellent work there to combine different analysis things. So one is a dynamics-based thing, then classical signaling processing by looking at the energy of the signal, and statistical analysis in terms of the mutation of the moments of the signal, and then in the end we tried some different classifiers to make the decision. So is this a seizure or not? And so these numbers in terms of sensitivity and specificity are too good to believe, actually. So that's why I'm giving him always a hard time to get more rubbish data. But so far, we always ended up with a very, very clean identification of seizures. So actually, so this is far better than the tools that are out there. So now, when we know the seizures, so we can try now to understand is there a difference from the underlying reason for your epilepsy, right? So then this is again one seizure given by the mutation, and here is a seizure that is induced by a drug. So and then we have for each of these conditions, we have 3 fish, and then we have more than 200 seizures for each of these conditions. And now, if you only take the classical tools for classification, so like the energy of the signal and so on, and now make a classification, then you see that actually, yes, we are not so bad in separating these things, but we have still a large overlay from seizures from between the different seizure conditions. But if we now include the dynamical perspective, so we get a very clean separation, right? So, and the reason for that one is this pre-ictal phase, as we call it, so the phase before the seizure occurs, and then we see that there are different dynamical properties. So in this mutation-based thing, so you see that the seizure is building up over time, so a little bit of increasing activity, whereas in this drug-induced seizure, so it's more or less flat, and we directly jump on the seizure. So for me, this is a kind of cool problem to understand, and that's why we built a model for that, a multiscale model, where we now consider the interaction between the neurons as well as with the astrocytes. Because so there's a lot of signaling, so meaning active neurons at the synapse also activate astrocytes. So then we have one equation for the neurons, so where this is this, well, simplified Hodgkin-Huxley model, and then these are the interaction between the different neurons and the astrocytes, and then you have an astrocytic model that is also then coupled to the neuronal activity and the activity to the neighbors. And then with that one, we can now compare the different topologies of the network in terms of coupling strengths and topology. And if you do that, then first of all, you see that yes, so the model has this different time scales. For the astrocytes, you see in blue a slower dynamics than for the neurons, that is shown in red. Now we can play around with coupling. So and then you can look into here this neuronal fields on the upper part, so which is 150 times 150 neurons, and in the lower plane you have then the astrocytes. And what you see here is that by just changing the coupling from a very weak thing where you do not have so high spatial correlations to very high thing where you then get a perfect synchronization, we can recapitulate the EEG signals that we had before. So where this would be the boring control condition, then this would correspond to the mutation where we have this building up of the seizure, and then we have this very strong drug condition where we go from seizure to seizure without any activation in the intermediate phase. And this is where we are at the moment. So actually we have now more conditions and we are still able to separate this. And at the moment we try then to map this into a more handy system where we can understand things better. So our mutation would correspond to the stochastic activity, so it's a noise-induced phenomenon. Whereas this more strong drug condition it looks more like a deterministic chaotic system. But here you are more than welcome to give input and ideas, because we are just in the phase of getting this done. And as a validation experiment, so we have set up now something that is called spin microscopy, and what you can see here now is the activity at single cell resolution of the brain. So each of these white dots blinking up is an individual neuron, and then you see that we can measure with that one also the spreading during the seizure. Okay, this was now on the time scale of a seizure, right? So from millisecond to 1 minute. But the question is, how does this epilepsy is establishing in the brain? So and then to understand this one, so we then now use this single cell technology to understand the heterogeneity of the brain, meaning that we took our control fish and our mutation fish and we smashed the brains and then looked into their transcriptional profiles. And then you get this matrix for thousands of cells and then 10,000 of genes. By then projecting this by Disney into 2-dimensional things, so you see that you can identify the individual subtypes. So again, the neurons, the astrocyte, and the microglia, based on these what we call metascores, so like gene signatures that represent specific cells. And now we can look for the different condition and the 2 different time points that we have, and we look at the heterogeneity, what is changing. And the main thing that is changing between the control condition and the epileptic model is this reactive astrocytes. So meaning that the astrocytes, these cells that are mediated between the blood cell and the feeding, so they change their state and now getting more hyperactive and a little bit aggressive to the neurons, which then leads actually to a dying off of this inhibitory neuron. So this GABA neurons, you remember? GABA, like inhibitory, yes. And what you see here is now the number of the GABA cells is decreasing significantly in the mutation, where it's actually a little slightly increasing in the control condition. If you do then the more direct comparison, you see that in the early time point, so the mutation has actually more GABAergic neurons than the control condition, maybe due to compensation. Also, biologists always use compensation if they don't know. But that the change from day 4 to day 7 is only a very strong significant in the mutation. And then again, you can use this high-dimensional data, and you can see again so that this is driven by gliosis, meaning activation of the glia cells, which is now the very nice bridge to the last topic I want to briefly speak about, which is then going towards the neurodegeneration. And so, in this Alzheimer field, so it's really frustrating because, Alzheimer is the highest rate of neurodegeneration. So it's increasing over time and we have no idea, right? So, so far we know 4 genes, 4 genetic risk factors that might be involved, but this hasn't helped at all compared, for instance, for Parkinson's. So there we know about 29 genes that are related to the disease. And we have a treatment that at least can, for some time, compensate the symptoms, whereas in Alzheimer's we are just lost. So, so that's why, or one reason for this lack is probably that we were focusing too long only on the neurons. So we tried to rescue the neurons by looking at the neurons and try to support them. But how is a neuron dying in the brain? So it's dying and eaten up. And it's eaten up by these microglia cells, by these immune cells. There's a traditional paradigm is so that you have a resting microglia that is screening the environment and looking for some bacteria or whatever has entered your brain, and then it's getting into this M1 state where it then starts to phagocytose the insult. And there's another function of microglia which is related to the repair function, meaning if you have an injury, not of your knee but of your brain, so then microglia go there and try to heal the wound, so to speak. But so both things can be bad and there's the wrong condition. So the phagocytosis, so the eating up mode, if these are overactivated in neurodegeneration, so they eat up your neurons and you lose your memory. the repair function can be also actually bad, because in brain tumors, this is hijacked, and then microglia actually supporting the tumor growth. That's why there is now an increased interest in microglia, and currently, so Beth Stevens and also us has shown that this traditional picture that there's only 2 states is actually not true, but that there are probably more like 8 to 12 different states of this microglia, and we try to identify these also in an Alzheimer context, where you see here now 1 to 1 millimeter part of a human brain from an Alzheimer patient. And in this cyan, you see neurons that are not so happy. So, meaning that we stain them for neurofibrils, that is a strong indicator that there is something not too good with the neuron. And then in magenta, you see now the microglia. And you see so that this one specific neuron here is strongly attacked by microglia, and in green, you see the surrounding astrocytes. So, and we wanted to understand now, so actually, what does the microglia are doing there? And for this one, we developed a computational tool, first for image analysis, so meaning that we automatically now can segment the individual cells from this large image stacks, and you then end up with individual microglia characteristics. So where you see here the morphology of a microglia, and then you can do a skeletonization of that one and generate a graph. And then in the end, we end up with 62 parameters that are describing a specific microglia. And since this is automated, we can generate now a lot of these representations. So at the moment, we have then 15,000 cells, and that we then can characterize in terms of like the volume or the degree of notation. And we can now compare now first of all between human and mice. And what you then see is that there is a specific morphology, a specific microglia cell that is not present in mice, but only in the human condition. And if you only then focus on the human condition and now compare controls to disease cases, you see that there are 2 morphologies of microglia that are enriched in the Alzheimer condition. If you see a specific localization of these cells, it's, at the moment it seems not to be the case, meaning that it seems to be more a global response. And since we now have so many data or so many cells, you can actually now try to understand the relation between them by doing a similarity approach or similarity analysis, where you now see that this cluster 7 corresponds to this resting state cell, so that is screening and tried to find the bad guys. And the cluster 1, that is actually enriched in Alzheimer, is this M1 state that is eating up the bad stuff. And the vision that is now in the field, and we try to promote this, if you could move some of these eating up cells into the more resting state things, so that you may prolong the time where you still keep your neurons and do not lose your memory so fast in Alzheimer's. But to do this, so we also have to look into the dynamics, and this is where Sophia is now working to make a mechanistic model to understand what's going in these cells. And with this, I come to my conclusion, because I talk now only about the larger scale, but we try to integrate this also up to the molecular level and looking into energy and metabolism. And with that, I acknowledge the group and the FNR for supporting the zebrafish work here, and you for your attention. Thank you.
Very much, Alex. Is there any question from?
Yes.
So this is the imaging you showed at the end of the human brain cells. Was that how is that acquired, and is this at the level of electron microscopy, or?
No, this is not so. Post-mortem brain samples, so meaning that we have you can ask for brains from a brain bank from Alzheimer patients, and then you get typically a small amount of these brains, and then we stain them with fluorescent dye, so that are specific for some proteins that are typically for microglia or for neurons, and then you can put them into a super resolution microscope. So and then you do confocal microscopy and get stacks, so image slices from these images.
So you had it down as a CA1 of the hippocampus. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's all C1.
And then you also showed some, in the final slide, live cell imaging. What type of live cell are you using?
So so our live cell imaging is mainly for mitochondrial aspects that I haven't talked here about. So where we look into mitochondrial trafficking. So because again to the problem, so that your little toe is somewhere immersed on the north of Luxembourg, 40 kilometers away, and so then we stain for the mitochondria, and by live cell imaging we can then look how mitochondria are transported along the axon to support the synapse, where then the signaling is happening. Because how immune is dying very often is so that it's a dying back mechanism, meaning that if the synapse is not feeling happy, so because it's either not getting activated anymore, it doesn't have the right energy balance, so then the synapse is given up, and then the axon is shortening and shortening and shortening, and then at one point the neuron just say, okay, whatever, I'm not useful anymore, so goodbye.
But is it fluorescent optical?
Yes, this is fluorescent. But we do EM work, so but then to look into the mitochondrial ultrastructure, so the internal morphology of mitochondria. So, but then this is static data. So that's why again there we combine then the static data with some agent-based modeling to try to understand how morphology is actually acting on the energetic capacity of these mitochondria.
Very fascinating. I also have a question about the imaging on the zebrafish, that nice 3D representation. How was that captured?
So this is it's called SPIM, so selective plane illumination microscopy, because the problem is so that these neurons are so fast, right? So and that you still want to capture the whole thing. So the trick there is that you do not do what the confocal microscope is typically doing by scanning with a focused light beam, but you generate a light shield. So then you have a full plane. So and then with one shot you get then the whole field of view. So with that one we can be fast enough to capture.
At what frequencies?
So the movie that I've shown was only at 25 hertz. So but we have optimized this now, so can go up to 50 hertz. But then. Yeah, so, but then you get also into the trouble of data capturing, you know. So that's why it's 25 hertz for us at the moment is good enough.
Oh, yes, sorry. Quantum modeling showed the integrations, non-notions showed.
Yes.
Are these stochastic? Will you introduce that?
Yes.
And how do you define the parameters?
Yes. That's a very fair question and a very tough one. We'll find it. So at the moment we are rather on a generic level, so meaning that we do not consider the full Hodgkin-Huxley model because it's large, and so you have.
That is the scale of the number of markers.
Yeah, so we simulate each individual neuron at the moment. So in this term here, so here this is noise term.
Yeah.
So in the first part here is a Fitz-Gnagumo. It's a Fitz-Gnagumo neuron, which is a simplification of the Hodgkin-Huxley version. So meaning that the parameters here you can translate from, if you have a Hodgkin-Huxley model, so and you say, okay, I expect this frequency rate, so then there are ways to estimate the parameters of the Hodgkin-Huxley model. So this is here for the specific dynamics. So we have a similar kind of idea, so how to model this one. The trick, and there's where we are more on the generic level, is that these interaction terms here are not really well understood. So it means that's why I do not, in my comparison, I just go from weak, intermediate to strong coupling. But the specific things here is ongoing research, I would say. So for me, it was more interesting so that we actually can see already similar dynamics as in the experiments, and now we have to go into details.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have to swap here. Okay, let me introduce Professor Claus Vögele from psychology here in the University of Luxembourg. We got to talk together because we are part of the same doctoral program, which is led by Andreas Zilian, who's here. And last time I also visited Claus, so nothing is going on the screen. When he was receiving in his lab someone who was working on addiction and the use of addiction to gaming and the use of data from the gaming websites to try to understand the probability that someone will become addicted to money games. So I found that really fascinating, and after that meeting I thought maybe that Claus would be an excellent speaker in this audience. And now I'm sure that this assumption will be confirmed once the monitor works. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. So Claus, thank you for accepting to come in this unusual audience, and we really look forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to move on from Alexander's neural level to the human behavioral level, so it's even more complex. So we're trying to use data modeling to predict human behavior, which is probably even more, or at least as complex as predicting the behavior of neurons in the brain. Of course, the behavior of neurons in the brain are the very basis of human behavior, so both areas are related. I also would like to make a bridge to the talk before, because I take a very health-oriented approach. I'm not representing psychology as such. It's huge. Data modeling applications are multifold in psychology, because human behavior, of course, is so interesting and so complex. So, of course, we need data modeling in all areas. And Stefan has just briefly mentioned that I was part of a meeting several weeks ago where we talked about problematic human behavior in terms of behavioral addictions, in particular people who get addicted to using the internet and video games. These are two areas that I'm not going to talk about today. I'm also not trying to give you a complete overview, because I can't. I take a very health-oriented approach, and I will give you two examples of ongoing research projects. My health approach that I would like to offer to you can be described as personalized medicine. And there are alternative terms that have been used, such as precision medicine, and I think it's also time to talk about precision prevention. We've published an article on what it is, personalized medicine. Most of you will be familiar with the concept, I'm sure. It's very interesting. It's small. I'm going to read it out to you. It's interesting to observe that the concept of personalized medicine is several decades old. At the very beginning, let me quote that first sentence here. In its most basic sense, personalized medicine refers to the provision of the right drug to the right patient at the right time. The topic stays absolutely the same, except that personalized medicine is not understood now to be applicable only to drug treatment. It actually applies to all sorts of interventions. And this is really where I'm coming from. So precision medicine has moved on to now to include all medical and behavioral interventions. It is important for all diseases that we know of, including essentially all chronic diseases, which are also, most of them are associated with health behaviors. So therefore, precision medicine needs to take into account behavior. And even if it is only, and the only is in very inverted commas, to make sure that people follow what they have been prescribed, which is called adherence. And someone once said, the best drug won't work if the patient doesn't take it. It's actually very simple. If we have the magic bullet to cure Parkinson's disease, it is of absolutely no use if we do not know how to optimize people's adherence to actually take it. Parkinson's disease would only be one example, and we still don't have the magic bullet. But we have, just to remind you, because it's gone out of fashion, a large population in the world who are HIV infected. And if they do not take their highly active antiretroviral therapy every day, the consequences for the individual and society are severe. So I think behavior is essential to be looked at here. So behavioral interventions play a major role in the management of chronic diseases and their prevention. I'm going to get onto the first example. This goes back to a project that was funded by the EU, an FP7 project that we completed 3 years ago, and it looked at the effects of neurofeedback in stroke patients. Why stroke patients? As you all know, strokes have a serious effect on all sorts of cognitive and motor functions. But what we try to do here is to try and help patients who have suffered a lesion in a certain brain area to recover some of the lost function. So the main concept here to realize is that the brain has an immense degree of plasticity. So instead of trying to do something surgically or drug related, we are trying to help the patient to learn new functions, i.e. to help the brain to branch out in other areas. And this is really what we do by neurofeedback. Let me come back to the more generic term to start with, which is biofeedback. Some of you may not be familiar with it. Biofeedback, and it includes neurofeedback, involves the electronic monitoring and online feedback of normally automatic bodily functions to train the acquisition of voluntary control of these functions. Probably the most widely known example for that, because it made headlines, is the use of neurofeedback to teach people in an advanced locked-in status, for example, people with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, which is a motor neuron disease, to train them to use a brain-computer interface to communicate. And they can do that through neurofeedback. And that's just one example. There were pictures on the media that you may remember. Someone is hooked up to an EEG, and they sit in front of a screen, and on the screen they would have, let's say, if they're keen on football, they would have a goal. And they're being told, we would like you to kick the ball into the goal. They don't know how they're doing that, but over several training sessions, a threshold or a particular ratio in EEG frequency bands will provide the signal to move the object target on the screen. So the trick here is that the EEG usually is not under voluntary control, but a person can still learn to exercise control over it. And we do that also with peripheral electrophysiological signals. So I'm using the feedback of heart rate variability, for example, which increases parasympathetic innervation, which is thought to help in all sorts of conditions. Now, neurofeedback uses EEG mostly, not only. There are other signals that one can use. And the neurofeedback uses brain-computer interfaces, which are called BCIs, and that allows an individual to control the computer application by brain activity as acquired. These interventions have been shown to be effective in a number of experimental trials. For example, people have been trained to increase the power in the EEG beta band, and that has a positive effect on certain cognitive functions such as declarative memory and also behavioral outcomes for some specific neurological and mental disorders. Okay, this project that I was part of looked at the development of such a system for stroke patients, and we are now left with a big data set, which is extremely valuable. This is just an overview of the different signals that have been used. There were 5 centers involved. Let's start on the left-hand side of the slide here. This is heart rate variability. So one can train people by telling them to move the bar up, that you can see there, to increase their parasympathetic innervation and therefore heart rate variability. Why would one do that? Because an increase in heart rate variability is related to a decrease in depression. And most stroke patients would experience depression after their stroke, which hinders all other therapeutic approaches. it's a very valuable treatment target. The next slide shows a picture for the training in slow cortical potentials. So the person would be told, please make the green dot larger. And again, the person concerned does not know how they do that, but somehow they implicitly learn to increase the yellow dot by increasing the power in slow cortical potentials. Why would that be important? Because it has been shown that an increase in slow cortical potentials goes hand in hand with an improvement in all sorts of conditions, such as autism, for example. Then there are some other signals that we have used. SMR stands for sensory motor rhythm. Then there are frequency ratios such as theta beta and upper alpha bands. So these all relate to the EEG frequencies that we can measure. And some of them have been shown to be related to specific cognitive functions that are affected by stroke. So for me at this stage it's important that you understand that we are trying to help the brain to improve at an electrophysiological level the conditions for relearning a lost cognitive function. And that is really what rehabilitation should be about. It was not a clinical trial. So therefore, I cannot show you the data in terms of did it work or not, because we did not have a control condition. It was about the development of that concept and the treatment module. What we still have is, of course, the data set, and this now is where I'm addressing you, and this is now funded through the DTU Driven, which is coordinated by Andreas Zilian. And we are trying to use that data set that we have now to address the following questions. We would like to identify patient characteristics to predict treatment outcome. That is essential in any area of the health sciences. Now we have become more specific, and I would like to ask the question, can we identify the most efficient feedback parameter or combination of them to achieve the best possible outcome? Another question, which is even more specific, can we identify the necessary or optimal number of training sessions, session duration, spacing of training sessions, and so forth? We are currently in discussions to go through the dataset again to see whether the dataset will allow us to use machine learning to answer these questions. There are requirements, of course. We do have just over 80 cases in our dataset, and all of them have done between 10 to 15 training sessions. We do need, of course, parameters that have been monitored throughout in all of these patients, and then I think we can start and develop ideas how we can model potential outcomes, which would then, and that's my understanding of machine learning, it's very superficial, then we can try and test what we generate there in terms of hypotheses. We can test these hypotheses then in clinical trials. I'll take you to the next example, which is my second example, and that is at the other end of the spectrum. So I'm not looking at patients here. This is very much about prevention. The project, which is funded by the FNR through a PhD industrial fellowship, looks at the development of a mobile application for increasing physical activity in adolescence. Why would that be important? Well, I think I don't need to tell you. Physical activity levels are decreasing in adolescence with all unwelcome health effects. We have large and increasing levels of young people who are obese, even if they are not obese. Low levels of physical activity do not bode well for that person's health in the future. So we need to do something about it. And you can also see what youngsters like to do. They like to play on their mobile phones. I know that we are playing on our mobile phones. Even some of you may be playing on your mobile phone now. That's fine. But people who, young adolescents who go to school, sometimes have two mobile phones, and they may be so busy with playing on their mobile phones that they don't do anything else. We need to collect them from where they come from. So you may be aware that in France legislation was passed, was it a couple of years ago, to ban the use of mobile phones in schools. I'm not so sure, being a psychologist, that this is going to actually make a lot of a difference, because although students at school may not be using their mobile phones there, once they step over the fence, they will be using the mobile phone even more. So I'd much rather use the mobile phone to get them to change their behavior. So that's the initial thought. There are a set of behavior change techniques that have been shown to be effective in changing people's health behaviors. And I'm just naming a few. Information provision. Yes, of course, we need to be told why we are supposed to be doing something. But if there is any real result from psychology over the last 45 years, is information is important, but it is not sufficient. Sometimes when I teach my students, and I hope I'm not offending anyone, I use as an example cardiologists who are amongst the heavy smokers. No one should know better than a cardiologist what smoking does to your heart. So I think that's a beautiful example of the wide gap between what you know and what you do, i.e. what we call the intention-behavior gap. And the intention-behavior gap is a large one. And probably all of us have been guilty, in inverted commas, at one stage or another, not to have been able to follow what I really had in mind I should do. I used to work as a fitness instructor in a large club, and the first 4 weeks in the new year we had such an increase in membership. It was just absolutely incredible, and typical client would come and say, oh, I'm going to do everything new in my life as from now, and over the next 4 weeks I'm going to lose 20 kilos. Which is very unlikely that this will happen, and it's certainly going to be painful if so. We need a completely different approach there, and it is about maintenance of learned behavior. So, an example of what we want to include in that mobile app you can see here. We are probably going to use GPS to track and map where people move, how they move, and make alternative suggestions. So that's the general approach. The two principles that we're using are, we use the established behavior change techniques, information provision, goal setting. I want to achieve not the 20 kilos in 4 weeks, but maybe 5 kilos in 4 weeks. And then that would be a sustainable goal. Goals, and we know that from neuropsychology, have to be challenging, but realistic. You can use it in your own life. If you have something that is too easy, it's completely demotivating. If it is unachievable, you're going to give up, you're going to resign. You need to meet the happy medium. And that could be something very personal. So I'm coming back to the beginning of my talk, which is about personalization. And the same applies here. Self-monitoring, material incentive, especially adolescents, might be quite accessible. Material incentive, self-monitoring, feedback, and prompts and cues. Something that beeps at you and says, "Have you? Do you remember?" Something like that, along those lines. But the second principle, and that's called just-in-time adaptive interventions, in its abbreviation JITI, and therefore by my US American colleagues called JEDI. And this is why you see Yoda here. A JITI is an intervention design aiming to provide the right type amount of support at the right time by adapting to an individual's changing internal and contextual state. That requires a lot of assessment, but this is where the machine learning would come in. I'm going to show you in a few minutes a slide where I will talk about how we try to integrate into the application a baseline period during which there will be increased machine learning. The machine will learn, the app will learn where the person is usually moving, under what conditions, under what situations, and how they respond. In terms of machine learning, of which I don't know much, I think they are called labels. So you have different contrasting maybe conditions, and you can say, okay, the person prefers to go jogging when it's sunny, for example, which we all understand. But another person might actually do jogging also when it's raining, I don't know. So this again brings us back to the personalization. Most of you will be familiar with a multi-armed bandit algorithm. So we are trying to implement this here. The current thought is that the application will automatically track different types of physical activity and cluster them according to location and physical activity type. So continuous running sessions will be grouped together with the previous continuous running session and not with a short late for the bus kind of run, because that's another type of activity. Implementation, and this is the baseline that I just mentioned. For the first 7 days, the application will collect data and learn about users' daily activities, the time location, the exercise intensity, etc. And then suggestions will be provided at time slots defined as the most advantageous, and that could be, for example, half an hour before moving from one stationary location to another, for example, from home to school and so forth. The strategy, well grounded in artificial intelligence research, falls under a wider decision-making framework called multi-armed bandit. This is my last slide, which gives you just an overview of the algorithm as we have developed it at this moment in time for 1 day. So this is a flow diagram essentially of different assessments and yes and no decisions for the algorithm, and then also the identification of time slots when to start an intervention. The interventions based on these behavioral change techniques that I showed to you. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions, if there is any. Yes,
is there any difference between the youngsters and adults about addictions, whether the addiction is very rooted in our brain and whether it's something fresh, and whether the approach can be adjusted?
That's a good question, and a good question is usually a difficult question, because it's very difficult to answer empirically. We have had these behavioral addictions only for a relatively short period of time. So we don't know, because we are observing a higher prevalence in youngsters, but it may be what we call a cohort effect. Adults may not or have not been exposed to the range of electronic devices as young people have been today. If we consider your question wider and we include other addictions, there is a lot to support the notion that addictions share one common neural network, independent of whether it's substance related or only behavior related, or as a colleague of mine once said, a reward is a reward for the brain. It doesn't matter where it comes from, it could be a drug or it could be behavior. Then I would say, you use the word rooted. Yes, anyone who's been involved in the treatment of someone with a serious addiction knows how difficult it is to change that. Still, I think there is everything to assume that there is at least the potential for people to unlearn the behavior that they once learned. It's a very behavioral approach that I'm taking here. So I'm not taking the biological psychiatric approach, which maybe people may already have a set up, which may be gene determined, that makes them more vulnerable and therefore even harder for them to get rid of their addiction. There isn't enough in the literature to support that notion. I think there is more in the literature to support the notion that in principle it is possible for people, by receiving appropriate therapy, to at least lower their addiction symptoms.
Yes. Very fascinating approach to use the device that causes sedentary behavior to actually maybe try to achieve the opposite.
Sort of I'm trying to make a saint out of the devil.
Yeah, exactly. That's a nice analogy. For capturing the physical activity, do you also use the phone, or do you rely on an additional device?
We use an additional device. We use a bracelet which uses Fitbit, which you of course know. It is quite crucial that one picks the right device, and that area is so rapidly evolving anyway. So we were looking for something which fulfills certain criteria. When one is interested in physical activity, one first has to realize that physical activity can take very many forms. It is not just running. I know I've only used that example, and of course running is something that from an assessment point of view we can assess relatively easily. I mean, accelerometers have been around for very many years, but what about someone who likes swimming? What about someone who likes perhaps even dancing? And I used in the early days accelerometers, and at the time I was working in London, and if you've ever traveled on the tube in London, you get a lot of this. And it is not your own physical activity, it's a tube which does it for you. So yes, I think this is a beginning, and I would hope that the developments in this sector will give us monitoring devices in the future which are still miniaturized, because otherwise I get bad adherence in my participants.
That's why with some with children, that if it's not fashionable, they may not
No,
want to be seen with such a medical
it needs
device.
to look nice, it needs to look cool, otherwise you will just not wear it. So yes, but I'm very confident that the development will provide us with devices that give us even the monitoring capacity for a whole range of different physical activity patterns in the future. It's not quite there yet, and of course we would like to measure heart rate as well, because it is nice to have a nearly objective parameter of exercise intensity. Now, not every increase in heart rate is related to physical activity. I might just come across someone, and it could be nice, or it could not be so nice, and heart rate will rise, and it has nothing to do with physical activity. So, you're aware of all of these problems. It's a start, I think.
And is there, what I also find interesting in the context of this experience sampling methods that you apply, is it also possible when you give the training or the advice for the candidate or for the participant to respond and say, okay, you should now do this, and they say, well, but I'm busy, or I don't want to. So I don't want to. Yeah, that's right.
This is something that we're discussing at the moment, so that we perhaps even more in terms of machine learning. I'm not sure whether that would be the right term here, but the system needs to get that information as well, and not only just by monitoring zero activity, but maybe there is a range of reasons why the person won't, and that is important and typical for that person.
Yeah, very nice.
Could this study also be used for preventing criminal habitual people?
Yes, to prevent
sort of predictive and habitual criminals.
And to prevent what? Criminal behavior? I haven't thought about that yet. Interesting.
A very well thing we should look for the system.
Yes. I can think of a lot of problems, but I think I see also the opportunities. I wasn't prepared for the question, so I can't really answer you. I can only say, interesting thought. Yeah, of course.
I will discuss with you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Claus, for your very. Okay, so we are running 30 minutes late. Could have been worse. Could have been better too.
So our next speaker is Christiane and we need to conclude our 6 minutes. Yes, you just start.
Okay, I just start. I will not make 15 minutes. I know the time before lunch is always not the very nicest one, but I will do my best. So, I'll give you a little presentation of the FNR, but before starting with the FNR, I would set you in the scene of the research in Luxembourg. So, Luxembourg, for the people who are not from here, Luxembourg is a very young and dynamic location. So public research started only 30 years ago, and the university was set up in 2003, and the FNR was just created before, so 1999, so a little bit more than, we are just celebrating our 20 years. So, and we are
Yes, good. Thank you.
So just showing you here the history of Luxembourg of research activities in Luxembourg. So we are now it's nearly 2020, and a lot has happened. So university, the public research institutions like LIH, Luxembourg Institutes of Socio-Economic Research, and the building where we are here, the Luxembourg Institute of Health, the LIH, and a couple of other ones. When I said Luxembourg started research funding, I will also add private investments in R&D. So you can see for the last years it has been tremendous increasing, and I think researchers can be lucky to be in a situation like that, that there is a continuous commitment from the government to support the activities. Here just our main institutions. They are next to the university, also a couple of other ones which are a little bit smaller. And why making research in Luxembourg? So it's an innovative place, and a lot of attractive activities are done here. A lot of people are just been here for around a couple of years, so it's a very dynamic. And the professors and people who are coming from outside, some have very prestigious grants from the Commission. And when you see here in Belval campus, so over 1 billion euros has been invested here. So it's quite a commitment from the Luxembourg government. So FNR, so Luxembourg National Research Fund, as I said, it's we are here for setting up excellence in research, and our mission is to set up world-class research here in Luxembourg. So we have a couple of key dimensions where we focus our activities on. So we are evaluating our proposals, most of them focusing on excellence in scientific quality. So our projects will be assessed according to international peer-reviewed standards. And we have a bigger developing activity in technology transfer to to get economic impact, and also through society. So if you know, I don't know if you are aware, FNR is also supporting a lot of public outreach activities. One bigger event will take place early November, the Science Festival, where also a couple of the people from here will participate. It's putting research activities closer to the public, closer to the kids in schools, in primary schools, in high schools. So where do our money come from? So FNR's money is coming from the government. So our Ministry of Tutelle, how it's called, is the Ministry of Higher Education and Research. And a mini part is coming from the European Commission. More than 90% flow over our evaluation processes to projects in our public research institutions, and a smaller part is going to promotion of science activities. So which areas do we fund? So we have I put here a slide of the last 5 years. So total investment of more than 300 million euros are mainly invested in our national research priorities, which are the big ones here: sustainable resources, biomedical research, material sciences, innovation in services, where a large part is ICT, and societal challenges, so social sciences and humanities, and other parts are mathematics and economics and law. So we are currently in the framework of evaluating our national research priorities. So it is expected that by end of the year, depending on the government decision, we get a reorganization of it. Let's say ICT will remain, materials they will remain. There will be some new ideas which come up, but the big ones will, of course, remain. So what do we fund? So we have larger projects, larger programs. So we call it project funding, where we have our core program, which is related to the national research priorities. And we have a big program which is called INTER. It's to develop or to get projects from Luxembourg researchers with international partners. So we have, FNR has a couple of agreements with funding agencies abroad. So Some main ones are, of course, the surrounding countries: DFG, Germany, ANR, France, RCUK, the Swiss National Science Foundation, the Netherlands, the Belgium, the two parts. There are multinational agreements as Aeronets, which are also co-funded by the European Commission. And we have also collaboration with Singapore, Japan, the NSF in the United States. So there are quite a lot of opportunities, and this program is quite heavily used. And we have a bigger part of our pot is the money pot is going to people funding. So we have the AFR grants. It's for the PhD support for the PhD students, where they are open to all domains, and there are a couple of ones are here in Luxembourg, but also abroad. And we have an attract and pearl programs. They are the aim is to attract people from outside Luxembourg. So high-profile researchers who come here, establish their labs here, bring their people if they have, or recruit people from here or from all over the world. Also, pearl candidates, we have a couple of those who are very active. The intermobility scheme is also quite interesting for researchers from Luxembourg to go abroad for a certain time, to go in prestigious institutions and make their research there for up to 1 year, or also for inviting people here to come and make their research activities here. Then, of course, I told already the PhD grants, and we have the Pride grant of Andreas Zilian, the Driven DTU. So it's a group of PhD students who are working around one topic. And we are currently have opened one call. The deadline is 8th of October, and I expect that maybe some new ideas will come up. This is also very, very interesting. We have a larger pot is going to innovation programs and technology transfer. So we have industrial fellowships, and the Bridges program are comparable to the is a doctoral and postdoc training in collaboration with companies in Luxembourg and abroad, and the Bridges are the same on project level. The IPPG is the counterpart of the Pride. It's doctor training, postdoc training, together with companies from here, from Luxembourg. We have currently one large program running with Goodyear. So there are a couple of students from Goodyear and from LIST who are going there. Jump Pathfinder, they are also proof of concept programs, so it's more in relation to getting research in collaboration done with companies. And the one part is then going to science communication, science research, outreach activities, and where we have the RESCOM, which is also quite of, which has quite some interesting component. You have the possibility to organize international conferences, and I know that Romain Zeil once did one. It was the large one we ever funded, we ever supported.
I'm going to say
Okay, great. And we have 2 calls there per year, so it's also very interesting in that respect. So I already told from the international collaborations, so we have a couple of activities going on there. So if anyone is interested, please leave us a note. FNR is also involved in international organizations. So in Science Europe, we are currently lucky our Secretary General is the President of Science Europe, and he has put forward the Plan S on the publication issues you certainly have known. And we are a member of the Global Research Council, Anterior, the institution of who's in charge of research integrity, and also the International Science Council. So here are a couple of companies where we are, where FNR is also collaborating with through PhD funding to project funding. So there's quite a lot, some larger ones from Luxembourg, but some smaller as well. Here's the science and society activities. So it's to promote research to the public, which is quite important, because if we have public support, it goes in line with government support, and it's taxpayers' money, so we have quite a lot that we have also to respond to current questions regarding research. So how do you get our money? So we this is what researchers are interested in. So we have annual calls. Some are open now, so please check on our website which ones are open now. We will launch the 2020 calls end of the year. There's all programs will have codes next year. Several have 2, several have only 1. So please check the data as they are all crossed over the year. Here are a couple of ones which are currently open. So it's the Bridges and the track program, industrial fellowships. Inter is always open. RPBG and Open Access Fund per couple of those. So everyone should find opportunities where to submit. So if we want to stay updated about what is going on at FNR, please subscribe to our mailing list and check regularly on our website. I think colleagues here, university, know what to do. If you have any question, please let us know.
Thank you so much, Christiane, for everything. We have questions from the audience. What goes next is an example of funding by FNR.
Yes. There was one question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about the funding for international research collaborations. Inter, is that primarily for German-speaking countries, or is it also to the US and other?
Yes, we have a so as NSF, National Science Foundation, does not sign any collaboration agreements. Otherwise, they have to sign it with all countries. So if so, you are based in the US.
Well, I'm based in Luxembourg, but I work.
Okay, so you should then, if you have, there's no topic limit at SNF. So if people from here are interested in collaborating with people from the US, you should contact your counterpart in the US, and he or she checks in which program of NSF this your idea.
Sorry, that there's no way for us to do a joint project proposal with NSF.
Ah, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, of course. So, what you have first to contact him to see in which program you would both submit, and then we have to see. So, yes, and you have to inform us later. We can talk later on. Yes. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. Okay, so the next and final presentation for this morning is by Professor Andreas Zilian, who is the head of the Driven project, which is a DTU, and also heading the computational engineering science cohort professors. And I think Andreas will tell us everything about this, so I don't need to go into too much details.
Yes, so that will be my pleasure. So DTU Driven shares a lot of similarities with Driven, the project that we are having, the workshop here today. But this actually is a different project. DTU stands for a Doctoral Training Unit, and we are thankful to the FNR for receiving funding to put this doctoral training unit here at the University of Luxembourg in collaboration with other Luxembourg institutes into practice. Before I start, I would like to give you the context. So as you know, or hopefully know, the University of Luxembourg is a very young university. So we are talking about only, let's say, a couple of years, funded in 2003. So things are still developing, and of course, we would like to participate, contribute, and take advantage of that. So we figured out that there are a number of colleagues working in the domain of computational and data science already. That is what Stefan calls, or likes to call, pockets of excellence. And instead of keeping that at a bilateral level, we thought it would be about time to bring that to an institutional level, to set a frame and the context to that, to these efforts that are done, and where research in that domain were successful. So we would like to leverage from institutionalizing these efforts. And the doctoral training unit is one of the building blocks that we hoped to establish at the university, also in collaboration with the other institutions in Luxembourg. So although I am coordinating this doctoral training unit, I'm not alone, of course. We have a total of 22 PIs on the project,
And the doctoral candidates that are being trained in the unit are 19. So 19 are funded through the project. But I can say that we are even training more doctoral candidates than just these 19. So we are happy to involve other doctoral candidates as well and let them participate. So the topic of the DTU is data-driven computational modeling and application. So you see, in terms of the scientific context, it's like it's like a very similar situation as we have for the H2020 driven project. However, this DTU intends to cover a wider variety of application problems. And therefore also the title with the reference to applications. So what we would like to do is use data science and data-informed modeling approaches in a variety of applications. So I would like to start to give two examples. One example is quite interesting because that is something that was the research that was executed in one of the partners of the H2020 driven project, the US partner in fact. And here what you see is the situation of Antarctica, and the intention of that project is to infer knowledge about the basal friction is at Antarctica from the displacement fields of the ice sheet. So it's intending to identify parameters by inverse modeling, and the challenge here are the wide variety of length scales that are involved in the physical process, but also the uncertainties. And the second example is from biology. So it's about this round worm that you see here, and the researchers there try to investigate how the locomotion of this round worm can be described and how this locomotion is done. So it's about the control principles, the basic principles, and the approach here is more a hierarchical approach. So while on the left it's about a spatial situation, here it's more a hierarchical situation. You will start from simple cells, neurons, up to the systemic level. And in fact, the data-informed methods used to approach these two problems are different. And what is interesting as well, that the basic methodologies are around for 30 or 40 years already. So what is new nowadays is that we can use much more information, we can process much more information and approach more complex situations. And of course that is interesting for us because we want to generate new knowledge. And that brings me, in the presence of, let's say, higher volume of data that needs to be processed and that can be processed nowadays, brings me to the data-driven discovery approach that we follow also in the DTU. So as you know, that is an iterative process starting from data mining, then going to a data-informed modeling, and then of course in the end we want to make some prediction, we want to analyze the model that we came up with, and we want to infer some knowledge. So we want to identify correlation and hopefully also causality, which is not so easy. And throughout this iterative process we have to deal with data. And that data, of course, is very seldom generic, but it's application specific. So the type of data, how the data needs to be used in order to generate models, all that is very specific to the application. And this is exactly what we want to approach in the DTU, in the research of the DTU, to take an application-oriented approach and make use of data-driven modeling. And the key idea here is that the underlying mathematical principles, but also the procedures and the algorithms used are very often the same, going back to the same mathematical principles. Applied mathematics is one of the core that this relies on. So once this can be understood, also in terms of training doctoral candidates, we hope that we can, let's say, shape the future for even more involved data-driven modeling and research here in Luxembourg. So, as you know, if we talk about data-driven modeling, we try to fill this arrow here in the middle, going from some input that is given to some output. So the output typically is some quantity of interest, and there are essentially two types of coming up with a data-driven model. The left is the more classical one, which means that the structure of that model is in principle known. We just need to fit some parameters. That's about model calibration. While the other, the example on the right, is starting from no a priori knowledge about the model, the mathematical, let's say, shape of the model. And this aims at identifying the model in the first place. So these are, let's say, the two ends of data-driven modeling. And somehow in between is probably the answer to a specific application. So on the left, we would have hypothesis-driven modeling, the classical ones, and on the right, the pure data-driven approach. And it is one of our aims to identify for which application or application field, what approach is maybe the best suited. So as I said, we are primarily coming from the application. So what we observed in Luxembourg, but also talking to partners, is that very often we have domain experts present who know their field and would like to go the next step, processing even more data, more complicated data, but there is a lack of expertise how to deal with it, how to employ machine learning methods, artificial intelligence. And this is exactly the starting point that we take here. We would like to train ourselves how to use these methods, but at the same time we would like to better understand these methods and not to treat them as black boxes. So the consortium that is shown here is covering a huge range of application domains: physics, engineering, biology, life sciences, behavioral, and the social sciences. And we are happy that this is supported not only by the University of Luxembourg and the LISA and the LIST. These are two Luxembourg institutes, but are also supported by the interdisciplinary centers in the university. And these application fields here are grouped around the common core. So our objective is to train our PhD students in these core methodologies so that they can make use of that in a variety of application domains. And hopefully are also able at some point to transfer that knowledge, because that is important, especially in the Luxembourg context, that the resources that are available are used. So in the consortium that we have, we kind of asked ourselves, so what data do we have? So we started from this map. Everyone put the type of data that they had on the table, and this is what we see. So we see very different data, very various sources of data. Also the characterization of that data is different. And then we asked ourselves, what is the mathematical abstraction behind that data? So we see that we can achieve a first grouping. Then we see, based on these abstractions, what sort of machine learning method or statistical analysis methods can be used. So we get a certain landscape here, and what type of knowledge can be inferred from that. And you see, then it was quite easy to locate in this landscape also the 19 research projects that we have. So we intend to train 19 PhD students. So we came up with 19 research directions which fill this rich landscape of data-driven discovery nicely. And you saw two of the colleagues that presented before this session are participants in this doctoral training unit, so you would find their projects here. So 3 examples quickly to underline the multidisciplinarity that we have here. The first example is a project located in investigating hydrological models. So you see here, we aim at combining knowledge or expertise from computational engineering and applied mathematics. Next colleague, you saw the presentation, Alexander Skupin. Cell neurodegeneration is a collaboration between systems biology and computational engineering. And the last example from the social sciences, economics, in fact, in combination or in collaboration with the physics department. So what we aim at is we have some domain-specific PI and some methodology experienced co-PI in all these projects involved, and that all to the advantage of the doctoral candidate that we try to train. So I'm happy to show you some pictures of our doctoral candidates. So this is the current state of the recruitment. I mentioned that we will have 19 doctoral candidates. So we just recruited the first cohort of doctoral candidates. And if you go through the pictures, then it's surprising that in contrast to a MINT typical situation, we have gender balance. So that is a good sign. And so these are the doctoral candidates that form the first cohort, and that are supposed to be in the center of our interest. And we try to group around the doctoral candidates a dense network of support or helping hands. So there is, of course, the supervision committee, and one of the key contributors here is the establishment of an individual training plan. So our students, because the situation is they could come from a domain expertise or they could come from a data science expertise. So we are quite open. We are not saying that we definitely start with some domain-trained PhD students, but we wanted to keep that open. Depending on the training level or the training focus so far of the doctoral candidate, we developed an individualized plan for the doctoral training. So the question could be how to train your dragon, or how to train, your data-driven model. That's in the end what we want to do. But if you think about it, it's maybe not only about the model, it's also about the data scientist. Yeah? So it's a bilateral, it's a bi-directional thing. So probably in this movie, it's not only the dragon that is being trained, but also the boy. So this is kind of reflecting the approach of what we realized when we set up this project, that in fact it's not only about doctoral training, but it's training of the supervisors as well. It's training about getting familiar with the data science approach in a variety of applications, and setting this up in a context so that larger groups of the university and the other institutes can participate and take advantage of that. So we came up with a training context for this, and I'm happy to say that this has multiple dimensions. We started in spring with our first courses, our first domain thematic courses, and what is nice to say is that we have about 5 or 6 courses that took place, and our observation is that not only our doctoral candidates participate in that, but we have a huge interest from all the institutions. They are sending their doctoral candidates to participate, for instance, in a course on advanced statistical analysis. So while we have something like 8 or 10 doctoral candidates now in our cohort, the interest in analysis, in statistics, was in the order of 50. So I think that is the right way to institutionalize these interest domains and make them available to a larger audience. And I'm looking forward to the developments in the future. There are also the doctoral candidates that will contribute. There will be symposia, there will be exchanges, there will be practical, let's say practical sessions. And that is maybe something that I would like to stress, that in my observation, especially when it comes to data-driven modeling, artificial intelligence, machine learning, that for the doctoral candidate, I assume the most important thing is to get to the real thing soon. So not some superficial talk about what can be done in principle, but we would like to, or it is important to train people to show examples, make them or bring them in the situation that they can really apply these things and test them for themselves. In the end, every application is a little different. So all the computational frameworks, methods, and so on are quite important, and that is well reflected in the course program that we set up. So in the end, I would like to mention the website. If you need further information of the DTU-driven project, please do not hesitate to go there. And in the end, of course, it's my pleasure to thank the FNR for the financial support, which is huge. It's close to 3.5 million in overall project worth, value, so to say. And that is a lot of funding money, but it's also a lot of responsibility, and we are looking forward to fulfill that and meet that responsibility. Okay, thank you very much. Is there any questions?
Do you involve in your doctoral training unit any contacts to companies in Luxembourg that are working more data-driven?
That is so far not part of, that is not part of, let's say, the structural approach followed in this doctoral training unit. However, that does not mean that we exclude it actively. The FNR has let's say, a scheme which is exactly for that situation. So maybe that scheme would be better suited. But nevertheless, who knows in the future, maybe in the second cohort or in the existing cohort of PhD students, there would be a stronger interest to reach out to companies. Yeah, so that both is possible here in Luxembourg with the help of the FNR. Can be done. Yeah?
Do you participate in any online training?
That is something, let's say, that is recommended to the PhD student, that they can participate then on their own in the available online courses. We are also happy to support that financially. But so far we are not, let's say, organizing these online courses on our own.
So you are not offering them?
If we offer or organize courses, then these are courses which are taking place here in an offline fashion. Old-fashioned, but more direct. Yeah. Okay. Good. Then, thank you.
Okay, so